Tonight, picture a low room in a walled town on a bend of a slow brown river. It is the middle of a winter night more than 3,000 years ago on a wide plain in the north of a country that does not yet have a name. Outside, the fields are frozen and pale, and the wind comes down off the lowest hills carrying a fine yellow dust that settles on everything and has settled on everything for as long as anyone can remember. Inside, a small fire has been kept alive since the middle of the afternoon. The air smells of ash and millet and the faint sourness of wet bone. A man kneels beside that fire. He is not young. In his hands he holds the flat underside of a turtle shell, scraped smooth, rubbed with sand until it shines like old ivory, and drilled along its hidden face with neat rows of shallow oval hollows, so that in each hollow the bone is thin as a fingernail. He has a question. It is not a large question, as history goes. He wants to know whether the king's toothache will pass before the new moon. He would like to know whether that hunt at the western marsh will be worth the walking. He wants to know whether the rain will come in the 5th month, and whether the harvest that follows will be a full one or a thin one, and whether the ancestors, who are close by and always listening, are pleased or displeased with how things have been going lately. So he takes a bronze point from the coals and he touches the glowing tip into one of the hollows. The shell answers with a small dry sound, a click like a beetle moving in dry grass. And on the polished face, where the bone is whole and unbroken, a crack runs suddenly out from the heat in 2 directions at once, a long stroke and a short one branching off it, and it stops. The man leans close. He reads the angle where the 2 lines meet. Then he takes a small knife with a fine point, and he carves into the shell, in careful upright characters, the question he asked and the answer the crack gave him, and the date on which he asked it. He carves his own name. He puts the shell in a pit outside with several thousand others, and he goes to bed, and the fire burns down. And the dust comes on the wind and covers it over. He has just done something that nobody in the room understands the size of. He has written. Not on wet clay that will crumble, not on wood that will rot, but on bone, in a script whose descendants are still being written today by more people than any other script on earth. The characters he cut that night are the direct ancestors of characters a school child would recognize now. The line runs unbroken from that fire to this evening, more than 3,000 winters, without ever being lost and relearned. For 30 centuries those shells lay under a village of mulberry trees. Farmers plowing there turned them up and thought them curious. They took them to the apothecary, who bought them by weight, ground them into powder, and sold them as dragon bones, for fevers and for wounds that would not close. A very great deal of the earliest writing on this planet was swallowed as medicine by people with headaches, which is the sort of thing that happens more often than we like to admit. Tonight we are going to follow that crack in the bone. Forward from there and a long way back before it, we will sit with a country that begins as a scatter of villages, growing a small hard grain on a yellow plateau. And we are going to stay with it through kings who were buried with their chariots, through 1,000 years of little warring kingdoms and the philosophers who walked between them looking for a ruler who would listen, through the man who welded it all into one piece and then set an army of clay in the ground to guard him, and through the long, steady empire that came after and gave the country a name it still uses for itself. It is a story of about 4,000 years, and by the end of it, you will almost certainly be asleep, which is entirely the point. So settle now into whatever stillness you have made for yourself. Let the pillow take the whole weight of your head, so that your neck has nothing left to hold. Let the lamp grow dim if it is not already dim. Let your shoulders come down from wherever the day left them, one quiet inch at a time, and then another inch, and then let them stay there. There is nothing in this story that you need to remember. There will be no questions afterwards. If you drift off during the bronze vessels and wake somewhere in the middle of a canal being dug through a mountain, that is not a failure. That is the whole design. You are allowed to lose the thread. The thread will keep going without you. If you enjoy these long, quiet histories, you might consider subscribing, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments. It helps other sleepless people find their way here, and there is something oddly comforting about scrolling through and finding somebody in a different hemisphere, in a different season, lying awake at the same moment you are. Now let your breathing get slower on its own. Do not manage it. It knows how. And let us go back one layer further than we need to a time before there was any such thing as China, when there was not even a word for it. Before there was a China, there was a shape of land, and the shape of the land decided almost everything that followed. Start in the far west, where the ground is highest. There is a plateau up there so vast and so cold that people have called it the roof of the world, and off that roof, from glaciers and marshes and small unremarkable springs, two enormous rivers begin. They begin close together within a few days' walk of each other. Then they wander apart, and they wander for thousands of miles, and they never truly meet again. The northern one runs first through gorges, then out onto a strange region of soft yellow earth. This earth is loess, and it is dust. It was ground fine by ice and blown east off the deserts of Central Asia over hundreds of thousands of years, and it lies in that country in beds that can be 600 feet deep. It is soft enough to dig with a wooden stick. It stands up in vertical cliffs without falling over, so people cut caves into it and live in them warm through the winter. It is also, and this matters more than anything, extraordinarily fertile without needing manure, because the minerals in it are still fresh and unweathered, and the wind keeps laying down more. The river cuts through that country and picks the dust up and carries it. So much of it that the water turns the color of milky tea, then the color of wet clay, then the color of a plowed field moving sideways. In flood it can be more than a third silt by weight. It is less a river than a slow liquid landscape being relocated. That is the Yellow River, and it made the north of the country, and it has killed more human beings than any other river on earth. Here is why. When it comes down out of the highlands onto the flat plain, it slows. Slow water cannot hold silt, so it drops it on the bottom in the channel. The riverbed rises. The people who live alongside build the banks higher to keep the water in. The bed rises again. They build again, century after century, until you have a river running along the top of a raised causeway of its own making, 10, 20, in some places 30 feet above the farmland on either side, held in place by nothing but earth walls and constant attention. And then, one wet year the attention fails somewhere, and a very large volume of water discovers that it is standing on a roof. The river has changed its mouth more than 20 times in recorded history, sometimes swinging hundreds of miles, emptying north of the peninsula one century and south of it the next, drowning whole provinces as it went. Every one of those changes rearranged who lived where and who owed what to whom. You cannot understand the politics of that plain without understanding that the single most powerful thing in it was made of mud and moved when it felt like it, which meant that from very early on, the people there had a problem that no household and no village could solve by itself. Keeping a river of that size in its bed requires thousands of people digging in a coordinated way in places that are not their own fields for the benefit of people they have never met in a season when they would rather be doing something else. It requires, in other words, somebody with the authority to make them. It is not an accident that the oldest hero in this whole tradition is not a warrior. He is a man who dug channels. Now come south. The other great river runs through a different world entirely. It is longer, the longest in Asia, and it does not carry that yellow dust. It runs green and blue through gorges so narrow and so sheer that for most of history a boat going upstream had to be hauled by men on ropes walking a ledge cut into the cliff. Then it opens out into warm, wet basins where the winters are mild and the summer air is thick enough to lean on, where the rain is generous and reliable, and where the crop is not the small hard grain of the north but rice, standing in flooded paddies, feeding more people per acre than the north could dream of. Between the two rivers lies a belt of hills, and between the two ways of living lies most of the tension in this entire story. The north was millet and wheat and chariots and dust and hard, cold winters and a long, open frontier facing the grasslands. The south was rice and rivers and boats and heat and forest and fever. For most of the story, the north held the power and the south held the food, and every few centuries the balance tipped. Wrap all of that in a monsoon. In summer, the wind comes off the ocean loaded with water and drops it inland. In winter, the wind reverses and comes off the frozen interior dry and bitter. The whole agricultural year is a bet on whether the wet wind will come far enough inland and stay long enough. If it does, there is a surplus. If it stalls a few hundred miles short, there is famine over an area the size of a European country. Then, close the box. To the west, that high cold plateau, uncrossable. To the southwest, mountains and jungle. To the east and southeast, ocean. To the north and northwest, desert, and beyond the desert, grass. That grass is the one door that never closes, and everything that ever walked through it walked through carrying a bow and riding a horse. So, a fertile, dusty, flood-prone north, a wet, rich, slow-warming south, a wall of mountain and sea on three sides, and one open flank facing a sea of grass full of people who could ride before they could walk. Hold that shape in your mind, loosely, the way you would hold a warm cup. Everything that happens for the next 4,000 years happens inside it. And now let us put the first people into it. They had been there a very long time already. People were living on that land before they were entirely people. There are bones from a cave in the hills southwest of the northern plain that belonged to an upright walker who used fire perhaps 600,000 years ago, and there are older stone tools than that. But bones in chip stone are a slow, patient kind of story, and we want the part where things begin to accumulate. Things begin to accumulate with seed, somewhere between 10 and 9,000 years ago, in two entirely separate places. People on that land stopped only gathering and started planting. In the north, on the lowest, the plant was millet. Two kinds of it, foxtail and broomcorn, small round grains on a nodding head, unglamorous, unloved by poets, and perfectly matched to that ground. Millet asks very little. It tolerates drought that would kill wheat. It ripens fast, in 90 days or so, which means it can dodge a bad season. And it grows happily in dust that does not need to be manured. A family with a digging stick, a stone-bladed knife, and a patch of hillside could feed itself. In the south, in the warm, wet basins along the lower reaches of the long river and the lakes beside it, the plant was rice. There is a waterlogged site down there where archaeologists found the remains of a village with wooden houses raised on piles above the mud, with mortise and tenon joints cut so cleanly that a carpenter today would nod at them, and beneath the houses, layer upon layer of rice husks and straw, half a meter thick in places, 7,000 years old. 2 cradles then, not 1. That matters. This story is often told as a single stream flowing out of the Yellow River Valley and gradually civilizing everyone else. And that telling is wrong, and the people who told it that way mostly lived in the north. Let us walk into one of the northern villages, because it has been dug out so completely that we can. It sits on a terrace above a stream, on the lowest, well inland, about 6,000 years ago. A ditch has been dug right around it, wide and deep, with the earth thrown up on the inside to make a bank. Whether that ditch was for keeping enemies out, or floodwater out, or the village pigs in, is a question people have argued about for a century, and the honest answer is probably some of each. Inside the ditch stand 40 or 50 houses. They are round, mostly sunk a little into the ground so that you step down into them, with walls of packed earth and a conical thatched roof held up by wooden posts, and a hearth set at the center of the floor with the earth around it baked hard and red. Smoke finds its way out through the thatch, slowly, and the thatch above the fire is black with it. It is warm in there in winter in a way that a house standing on the surface would not be. At the center of the village is a much bigger building, big enough for everybody, and the doorways of all the small houses face towards it. Around the edges are the kilns and the storage pits, and beyond the ditch, the burial ground, laid out in orderly rows with the dead facing west. They kept pigs and dogs. They grew millet and cabbage and hemp. They fished the stream with bone hooks and with nets, and we know about the nets because we have the stone weights that held them down. They hunted deer when they could, and they made pottery, which is where this village stops being a collection of postholes and starts being a place with a personality. The pots are reddish, made from local clay, built by hand and finished on a slow turntable, and then painted before firing in black or dark purple with a brush, in designs that have not stopped being interesting for 6,000 years. There are running spirals. There are nets and lattices. There are dancing figures holding hands in a circle around the inside of a basin, so that when the basin is full of water, the dancers appear to be standing at the edge of a small, still pond. And there are fish. Fish everywhere, drawn with a confidence that comes from long practice, and then, gradually, fish that stop being fish. Over generations, the fish get simplified, the fins become straight strokes, the body becomes 2 triangles, until you are looking at a pattern that only somebody who knew the whole sequence would recognize as an animal at all. It is one of the clearest windows we have into how a picture becomes a sign, and a sign becomes, eventually, a thing you can write. There is a design on some of those basins that has haunted people ever since. A human face, round, calm, with a faint smile, the eyes closed or nearly closed, and a fish attached to each ear and something like a triangular cap on the head. Nobody knows what it means. There have been 100 learned guesses. It might be a fishing charm, a spirit, a shaman, a child's grave marker. What it is, without question, is somebody's idea, drawn carefully, repeated across many pots and many years, because other people agreed it was worth repeating. That is, culture, arriving, now leave the north and go down to the wet country near the eastern coast, to the marshy lowlands south of the long river's mouth about 5,000 years ago. Because something extraordinary was happening there, and almost nobody outside that field has heard of it. There was a city down there. Not a village, a city. It had an inner-walled precinct nearly 2 miles around, built on an artificial platform of clay hauled in from elsewhere. Outside it lay an enormous system of dams and levees, 11 of them found so far, designed to catch the mountain runoff and hold it and move it, protecting the low ground and letting boats travel. Building that system took an amount of coordinated labor that historians of other regions would comfortably call state formation. The rice paddies fed tens of thousands of people, and those people carved jade. Jade is not like other stone. It cannot be chipped or flaked because it does not fracture cleanly. It is a mass of interlocking fibers, tougher than steel in some respects, and the only way to shape it is to abrade it slowly, with wet sand and a cord or a stick, wearing it away a little at a time. To drill a hole through a jade disc 6 inches across is not an afternoon's work. It is weeks. It might be months. They made discs, flat rings, polished to a soft green or milky white, some as wide as a dinner plate, with a round hole at the center. They made hollow squared tubes, round on the inside and square on the outside, sometimes 1.5 feet long, with faces carved at every corner of every tier. And on the very finest of those, at the corner joints, are engravings so small that you cannot see them properly without magnification. A figure in a huge feathered headdress riding on the head of a beast with enormous round eyes, rendered in lines finer than a human hair, cut into a material that resists everything, by craftsmen with no metal tools and no lenses. Nobody has satisfactorily explained how they did it. They buried these things by the hundred with a small number of people at the top of that society and buried almost nothing with everyone else, which tells you something about how that society was arranged. Then, around 4,000 years ago, the water rose, or the climate shifted, or the fields salted, and the city was abandoned to the mud. And the shape of the discs and the tubes traveled inland and upstream and north and turned up in the tombs of people who had never seen a paddy field. Something else was being made in those wetlands, and it would matter more than the jade. There is a small ivory cup from that region carved with what looks unmistakably like a silkworm. There are fragments of woven silk from a tomb more than 5,000 years old. Somewhere in that damp green country, somebody worked out that the pale caterpillar, which eats mulberry leaves, spins its cocoon from a single continuous filament, that the filament can be 1/2 mile long, that if you drop the cocoon in hot water, the gum softens and the thread lifts free, and that if you gather several threads and twist them, you get a fibre stronger than any other natural fibre and shinier than anything on earth. The legend gives the discovery to a queen sitting under a mulberry tree when a cocoon falls into her hot tea and begins to unravel. Almost certainly it did not happen that way. Almost certainly it happened 1,000 times over 1,000 years to people who did not write anything down. But that thread would eventually reach across a continent, and men in the marble cities of the far west would pay their weight in gold for it without having the faintest idea what it was made of. And the road it traveled would carry religions and diseases and horses and paper in both directions for 1,500 years, all from a caterpillar in a wet valley, noticed by somebody patient. Meanwhile, back in the north, on the dusty plateau, the villages were changing. The painted pottery got less painted, and the pots got harder and blacker and thinner, much thinner. There is a kind of black pottery from the later phase up there that is called eggshell ware, because the walls are less than a millimeter thick, thrown on a fast wheel with a delicacy that is frankly showing off. In shapes with tall stems and flaring cups that have no practical use whatsoever except to be lifted at a ceremony by somebody important. That is the signature of a change. When craft moves from useful to spectacular, somebody has surplus, and somebody wants to be seen having it. The ditches around the villages got deeper. Then the ditches became walls of rammed earth built by a method that would be used on that land for the next 4 millennia and is still used in places. You set up 2 parallel wooden boards, you shovel a few inches of damp earth between them, and then several people beat it with stone or wooden rammers over and over until it is as hard as soft rock. Then you add the next layer. A wall built like that shows horizontal lines in its face, like the growth rings of a tree, one line for each day's beating. Some of those walls enclosed 30 acres. Some enclosed a great deal more. Up on a high lowest terrace in the north there is a stone-walled site 4 times larger than that, with a stepped pyramid at its heart faced in stone. Jade blades pushed into the joints between the courses, and it is 4,000 years old, and nobody knows what to call the people who built it. The dead started to be buried differently. In the early villages, almost everybody got roughly the same hole in the ground. By the later phase, a few graves are deep shafts with wooden chambers containing dozens of vessels and jade and lacquered wood. And most graves are a body in the dirt with nothing at all. Weapons appear. Skeletons appear with injuries that were not accidents. And the pattern of settlement changes shape. Instead of many similar villages, you get one large center with a wall and a cluster of smaller places around it that seem to be feeding it. That is the arrival of the thing we will spend the rest of the night with. Not farming, which was already old, not craft, which was already extraordinary, but the moment when some people in a valley could tell other people in that valley what to do, and make it stick and pass the ability to their children. Kings, in other words, were coming. Every people keeps a story about the time before their records begin, and the story is never quite true and never quite false. That country's version starts with a run of sages, each of whom hands over the world to the next in an orderly and improving way. One teaches people to fish and to make nets. One teaches them to plant. One invents the calendar and the compass cart and, according to some, has 4 eyes, which does seem like an advantage in that line of work. One rules so well that the phrase for his reign becomes a byword for good government forever after. And rather than give the throne to his own son, he looks around for the most capable man in the land and hands it to him. That is the part of the story that mattered most to everybody who came later. Rule went to merit. The sage picked his successor by watching how he behaved, not by counting his ancestors. For the next 3,000 years, every scholar who wanted to tell an emperor he was doing badly reached for that story, and every emperor who wanted to be told he was doing well had it read aloud at dinner. Then came the flood. The waters rose, and they did not go down. They covered the fields and lapped at the hills and drove people up onto high ground where they crowded together and starved. The king appointed a man to deal with it, and the man did what seems obvious. He built dams. He tried to hold the water back with walls, and for 9 years he built walls, and the walls failed. And then he was executed for his failure, which was harsh but does at least indicate that the job was taken seriously. His son was given the same task, and his son looked at the whole thing differently. He did not try to stop the water. He dug. He opened channels through the hills and cut the mountains where they blocked the drainage and led the water away downhill to the sea. And he worked at it for 13 years, and in all that time he passed the door of his own house 3 times and did not go in. The first time his wife was in labor and he heard the child cry, and he kept walking. That is the founding legend, and you should notice what kind of legend it is. Other traditions begin with a warrior, a lawgiver on a mountain, a wolf, and 2 brothers. A city walled by a god. That one begins with a man doing enormous, boring, useful public works and skipping his own family life to get it done, and being honored above all others for it. A country whose central problem was water made its first hero an engineer. When it was over, they say the king tried to give him the throne, and he tried to refuse it, and eventually he took it. And when he died, the throne did not go to the most capable man in the land. It went to his son. So the sages ended, and a dynasty began. And the name of that dynasty was the Seah. And people have been arguing about whether it existed for about 100 years. The case against is simple. Not one contemporary document names it. The earliest text that describes the Shia in detail was written well over 1,000 years after the Shia is supposed to have ended, by people with excellent reasons to want a tidy sequence of dynasties in their past. No inscription from the period says the word. The case for is that something was clearly there, out on the inland plains, on a small river in a broad, fertile basin. There is a site that stops the argument being easy. It was a town of something like 1,000 acres, laid out around a core of palace compounds on rammed earth platforms, with the buildings squared to the compass and set around courtyards behind gatehouses. There are straight roads, wide enough for 2 carts, and in the dirt of one of them are the ruts of wheels running parallel. The oldest wheel tracks in that part of the world. There is a walled enclosure that seems to have been a workshop district, and it is fenced off, guarded, kept separate. Inside it, they cast bronze. That is the thing that changes everything. Somebody had learned to mine copper ore and tin ore in different places, sometimes hundreds of miles apart, to smelt them, to alloy them in the right proportion, to model an object in clay, to build a mold around it in sections, to fire the mold, to reassemble it, and to pour molten metal into it and break it out clean. Every stage of that requires specialists who do nothing else, which requires farmers producing enough surplus to feed people who do not farm, which requires somebody organizing the surplus. And what did they make with this astonishing new capability? Not, at first, tools, not plows. Almost no farming equipment at all for centuries. They made cups. They made 3-legged vessels for warming wine and wide-mouthed vessels for holding it and deep bowls on stands for offering cooked grain. They made bells. They made plaques inlaid with hundreds of tiny turquoise tiles in the shape of a long-bodied beast with round eyes. They made, in other words, the equipment of ceremony. Bronze in that country was not primarily a technology of production or even of war. It was a technology of legitimacy. The vessels were used to feed the ancestors, and the right to feed the ancestors properly was the right to rule, and so the metal itself became the physical form of authority. Later there would be a phrase for asking impertinently about somebody's power. To inquire about the weight of the vessels. Whether the people at that site called themselves the Jia, we cannot know until somebody finds writing there, and so far, nobody has. What is certain is that around 3,600 years ago, in that basin, a settlement existed that had palaces, roads, planned quarters, controlled craft production. A distinct elite buried with bronze and jade and turquoise, and influence radiating for hundreds of miles. Something was in charge of something. And then, around that same time, the center of gravity moved and a new power came up out of the east. The tradition says the last Sia king was a monster. He was cruel and extravagant, and he built a lake of wine large enough to row a boat on. And he made 3,000 people drink from it at the beat of a drum, and he kept a favorite who liked the sound of tearing silk, so he had bolts of it torn for her amusement all day long. He ignored his advisers. He drove his people to despair. And so heaven withdrew its favor from him, and a virtuous lord from a neighboring domain rose up, reluctantly, only after long refusal, and overthrew him, and founded the Shang. You will hear that story again. You will hear it with small variations at the end of the Shang, and again at the close of several dynasties after that, and by the third time you will notice that the last king of every fallen house is a drunkard with a wicked concubine and a lake of wine. And the first king of every new house is a modest man who did not want the job. That is not history. That is a template, and it is among the most successful pieces of political technology anybody ever invented, and we will come to who invented it and why in a little while. For now, let it be enough that the power shifted east onto the Great Plain, and that the new people were called the Shang, and that unlike the Sia they left their own words behind, cut into bone. Let us go to their capital. By the time we can see them clearly, they had moved several times, and the place where they finally stayed for 2.5 centuries lies on a small river in the northern part of the plain, under fields of wheat and a scatter of modern villages. It is not walled as far as anyone has found, which is strange and interesting. It sprawls. It covers something like 10 square miles of palace platforms and workshops and cemeteries and ordinary houses, with the river looping around the royal core. Stand in it on a summer morning about 3,200 years ago. The palace buildings are long halls on rammed platforms, with wooden pillars set on stone bases and roofs of thatch and the timber painted. There is no stone architecture, none, in a place with plenty of stone available. They built in earth and wood, and they went on building in earth and wood for the whole of their history, which is why almost nothing above ground survives anywhere in that country from before the last 1,000 years, and why the archaeology is all foundations and postholes and pits. Around the palaces are the workshops, and this is where the noise is. There is a bronze foundry covering acres. There are furnaces and heaps of charcoal and thousands of fragments of clay molds thrown out after a single use. There is a bone workshop where they cut hairpins from cattle bone by the tens of thousands. There is a pottery works. There is a jade shop. And there is scale here that is hard to hold in the mind. They cast a rectangular four-legged cauldron for a royal funeral that weighs 832 kilograms. To pour that in one go, using crucibles of the size they had, takes something in the region of 70 or 80 crucibles emptying simultaneously into the mold, which means dozens of men moving white-hot metal in perfect coordination on a signal, with no second chance. The mold assembly alone would have been the work of months. They did this repeatedly. Thousands of ritual bronzes survive, and every one is a small industrial project, and they were made to be buried. Now, go into the royal cemetery on the far bank. The great tombs there are shafts 30 or 40 feet deep, with long sloping ramps running into them from four directions, so that from above they look like enormous crosses cut into the earth. At the bottom is a wooden chamber. In it went the king, and with him went bronzes, jades, weapons, drums, whole chariots with their horses still in the traces, and people, a great many people. That is the hardest part of the Shang to sit with, and I am not going to dwell on it, because it is not what this night is for. But honesty requires saying that the ceremonies of that court consumed human lives in numbers that are recorded plainly in their own writing. Prisoners taken in the constant campaigns against neighboring peoples, and that this was not hidden or shameful, but counted and dated and filed. It was a world in which the boundary between the living and the dead was thin, in which the ancestors were not a memory, but an active and demanding presence with opinions about the harvest, and in which the king's whole function was to stand at that boundary and manage the traffic. Which brings us back to the shells. In 1899, a scholar in the northern capital fell ill with malaria. He sent out for medicine, and the apothecary sent back the usual mixture, and among it was the powder called dragon bones. But some of it was still unground, and the scholar, who happened to be one of the leading experts alive on ancient inscriptions, looked at the fragment in his hand and saw marks on it. He looked closer. The marks were writing. Not any writing he knew, but writing unmistakably in a script older than any he had ever catalogued. He asked where the bones came from. The apothecary did not know, or would not say, because the dealers guarded the source. It took years and several deaths and a good deal of unpleasantness before anyone traced a supply back to the fields above that sprawling site on the small northern river, where farmers had been plowing up shells and shoulder blades for generations and selling them by the sack. Something over 150,000 inscribed pieces have been recovered since. They are the oldest substantial body of writing in Eastern Asia, and they are, in the most literal sense, the transcript of a court's anxieties. The procedure was this. A question was posed out loud in the king's presence, usually by the king himself in the later reigns. It was posed twice, in a positive and a negative form, so that the answer could come as a choice: it will rain, it will not rain. A shell or a shoulder blade, already prepared with drilled hollows, was heated with a hot point, and the crack that ran was inspected. And the king pronounced the reading. Afterwards a scribe carved the question, sometimes the king's forecast, and sometimes, later, what actually happened. That last habit is the gift. Because a great many of the bones carry a note added afterward saying that it did in fact rain, or that the hunt took 2 rhinoceros and a tiger, or that the child was a girl, which the king had declared inauspicious. So we can read the daily worries of a court 32 centuries ago. Will there be misfortune in the coming 10 days? Will the king's tooth be cured? Is the tooth caused by an ancestor's displeasure, and if so, which ancestor? Should we offer 3 sheep or 5? Will it rain on the millet? Should the king go hunting tomorrow at the eastern woods, will the queen's childbirth be easy? Will there be trouble on the western frontier? Has the ancestor accepted the offering? Should we campaign against a certain people this season? They divined about the weather constantly, which tells you what mattered. They divined about toothache, which tells you how much the ancestors were thought to concern themselves with the body of the king. They divined about dreams. On one bone, the king has apparently dreamt of a particular dead relative and wants to know what it means, and that is the single most human sentence anybody wrote down for 1,000 years in any direction. The writing itself is already mature. That is the frustrating part. The characters on those bones are not a first attempt. They have conventions, abbreviations, standard forms, and about 4,000 distinct signs, of which perhaps a third have been securely read. A system that developed must have taken centuries, and it must have been done mostly on bamboo and silk and wood, which rot. So the beginning of that script is simply gone, and what survives is the corner of it that happened to be cut into something durable, for a purpose that had nothing to do with keeping records. And the structure of it explains why that country's writing never turned into an alphabet. Some characters are pictures, worn down to a few strokes. The sign for a mountain is 3 peaks. The sign for the sun is a circle with a dot in it, squared off over time because a circle is hard to cut in bone. The sign for a field is a square divided into 4. Some are compounds of meaning: a woman under a roof, a hand holding a brush, a sun and a moon together for brightness. But the great majority, then and now, work another way. One part suggests the meaning. The other part suggests the sound, and that turns out to be a magnificently practical arrangement in a place where the spoken language differs enormously from valley to valley. 2 men from provinces 1,000 miles apart may be unable to exchange a sentence out loud and yet read the same page without difficulty, because the sign does not spell a sound, it points at a thing. Hold on to that, because it is among the 2 or 3 reasons this country kept coming back together after every collapse, when other empires that broke apart stayed broken. Writing was the glue, and the glue did not dissolve in dialect. Now, one more thing from that cemetery, and it is the best thing in it. In 1976, an archaeological team working on a low rise outside the palace zone found a small tomb. It was modest by royal standards, a pit about 18 feet deep with no ramps at all, which is why it had not been noticed, and, far more importantly, why it had not been robbed. Every single one of the great ramped royal tombs on that site had been emptied in antiquity. This one was intact. Inside were nearly 2,000 objects, 468 bronzes, together weighing more than 1.5 tons, 755 jades, some of them centuries old when they were buried, heirlooms already antique, nearly 7,000 cowrie shells, which were money, ivory cups inlaid with turquoise, bone hairpins by the 100. And many of the bronzes carried the same 2 characters, a name cast into the metal. The name was known. It appears on the oracle bones on more than 200 of them, and it belongs to a woman. She was one of the consorts of a king who reigned in the 13th century before our era, and the bones say that she led armies. There is an inscription asking whether she should be sent against the people on the western border with 13,000 troops, which is the largest force named anywhere in that entire archive. There are divinations about her campaigns against 3 separate enemies. She conducted the state sacrifices, which was priestly work of the highest rank. She had her own estate that sent tribute in to the capital. She had her own bronze weapons cast with her name on them, including 2 enormous battle axes. And she had children, and the king worried about her constantly. He divined about her pregnancies. He divined about whether her illness would pass. And after she died, which she did before he did, he kept divining, asking whether he should make offerings to her, asking whether she was well, asking her to intercede with the more senior dead on his behalf. He built a hall over her grave so that the ceremonies could continue directly above her. She is the earliest woman in that country's history about whom we know almost anything at all, and what we know is that she was a general, a priest, a landholder, and, unmistakably, somebody her husband could not stop thinking about after she was gone. Her jades are worth a moment on their own. There are dragons coiled nose to tail. There are birds and fish and frogs and a small elephant with its trunk curled up, which is a reminder that the climate then was warmer and wetter and that elephants and rhinoceros lived on that plain and were hunted there. There are pieces carved 1,000 years before her time in the style of that lost jade city in the wet South, meaning they had traveled and been kept and handed down and were treasured as ancient even then. People collected antiquities 32 centuries ago. That should make anybody feel better about their own cluttered shelves. The Shang lasted in that final capital for around 250 years under 12 kings. They were not, it should be said, the only power on that landscape. The tendency to draw a map with one blob on it labeled Shang and nothing else is a habit of textbooks. There were bronze working peoples all around them with their own traditions and their own gods, some of them very strange indeed. Far to the southwest, in a rich basin behind mountain walls, a sacrificial site was uncovered where people had buried enormous quantities of bronze and jade and elephant tusk in pits, deliberately broken and burned first. Among it were bronze heads with gold foil masks. There were standing figures 8 feet tall. There were masks 3 feet wide with eyes that project several inches out of the face on stalks, and ears like wings, and a nose like a curl of smoke. And there was a bronze tree nearly 13 feet high with birds perched on its branches and a dragon coming down the trunk. Nothing in that assemblage looks like the Shang. Nobody knows what language those people spoke or what they called themselves, and they left no writing, and their culture vanished. But they were there, at the same time casting bronze on a scale that rivaled anything on the plain. In a style so alien that when the first pits were found in the 1980s, some scholars quietly wondered whether it was a hoax. The world was full. It always is. We only ever see the parts that wrote things down or built in stone. Back on the plain, though, the Shang were doing what powerful states do when they have been powerful for a long time. Their campaigns were reaching further and coming back thinner. Their court was consuming an enormous share of everything the country produced. Their divinations were becoming more formulaic, more optimistic, more about routine 10-day auspices, and less about genuine questions, which is what happens to any institution that has stopped listening for bad news. And out to the west, up the valley of a tributary river, in rough country on the edge of the Loess Highlands, there was a client people who paid tribute to the Shang and provided troops to the Shang and had been useful to the Shang for generations. They were called the Zhou. They farmed hard ground. They were regarded by the court as somewhat provincial, which they were, and somewhat rustic, which they also were, and safely subordinate, which they were not. The Zhou had been edging closer for 2 generations before they moved. They took wives from allied houses. They absorbed smaller neighbors. They built a new capital downstream from their old one on better land, and then another one beside it. And they gathered around themselves the discontented, of whom there were always plenty, lords who had been slighted at court, peoples who had been raided for captives, minor states tired of sending tribute east and getting nothing back but demands. The old Zhou chief who did most of this work died before he could use it. His son inherited the alliance, waited, and then, on a winter morning, moved east across the river with an army. The battle happened at a place on the plain a little south of the Shang capital at dawn. 11 centuries before our era. The Zhou account says they had 300 chariots and 3,000 picked guards and 45,000 foot. It says the Shang had 700,000 men, which is a number invented by somebody who wanted the victory to sound better, and we can quietly set it aside. What the account admits, almost by accident, is more interesting than the arithmetic. It says that the Shang host was largely made up of captives and slaves, and that at the first shock they turned their weapons around and opened a road through their own line for the invaders. The Shang king went back to his palace, put on his robes and all his jade, and set fire to the building with himself inside it. By the afternoon, the Zhou were in the ceremonial precinct, and the man who had led them stood where the Shang kings had stood and made offerings to heaven, and the thing was done. A dynasty that had lasted 5.5 centuries ended in a single morning because its own soldiers preferred the other side. And then the new rulers had a problem, and their solution to it is the single most consequential idea in that country's entire political history. The problem was this. The Shang kings ruled because they were descended from the ancestors, and the ancestors were the channel to the high God, and therefore the Shang were the only people on earth who could make the offerings that kept the world working. Their right to rule was hereditary and exclusive and permanent. That was the whole theory. The Zhou had just proved it wrong with an army. But if they simply said that power belongs to whoever wins, then their own grandchildren would hold the throne on exactly the same terms, which is to say, on no terms at all until somebody stronger came along. So they said something cleverer. They said that heaven does not belong to a family. Heaven cares about the people. Heaven grants the right to rule to a house that governs well, and heaven watches. And if a house becomes cruel and idle and deaf to suffering, heaven withdraws the grant and confers it elsewhere. The Shang had received it justly long ago from a virtuous founder. Their last king had squandered it by his conduct. The withdrawal was heaven's decision. The Zhou had merely been the instrument. They called it the mandate of heaven. Look at what that does. It makes rule conditional. It makes it moral. It makes it revocable. It gives every subsequent rebel a legitimate vocabulary and every subsequent ruler a permanent reason to be nervous. And because heaven's displeasure was thought to show itself in signs, in floods, in droughts, in famine, in earthquakes, in comets, it meant that for the following 3,000 years, any natural disaster anywhere in the empire was also a political event. An emperor whose river burst its banks was not merely unlucky. He was under review. It also produced the template we noticed earlier. Once you have decided that dynasties fall because their last ruler was wicked, then every fallen dynasty must be given a wicked last ruler. And the historians will supply one, complete with the wine lake and the cruel favorite, regardless of what the man was actually like. History in that tradition was not written to record what happened. It was written to demonstrate the mechanism, so that the current ruler would read it and behave. It is propaganda, and it is also in a strange way. One of the earliest sustained arguments anywhere that a government exists for the benefit of the governed and can be dismissed if it forgets. The Joe King who won the battle died 2 years later, and his heir was a child, and that could easily have finished the whole enterprise. What saved the new order was the child's uncle, who acted as regent for 7 years, put down a serious rebellion by his own brothers and the surviving Shang royal line, campaigned across the whole eastern plain, built a second capital further east to hold it, and then, at the end of the 7 years, handed the government to his nephew and stepped back down. That last act made him the most admired man in that civilization for the next 3 millennia. Every later minister who held power for a boy king was measured against him and mostly found wanting. Confucius, 500 years afterwards, said that he knew he was getting old because he had stopped dreaming about him. Now, how do you hold a territory that size with bronze weapons, no paper, no coinage worth the name, and roads that are mostly tracks? You do not. You cannot. So the Zhou did the only thing available and gave it away on purpose. They cut the conquered land into domains and handed each one to a relative, a loyal ally, or a member of the defeated house who had come over. Along with the land went the people on it, a ceremonial charter, bronze vessels, sometimes a body of Shang craftsmen or diviners transferred bodily to the new lord like tools. The lord went out, built a walled town, ruled from it, and owed the king military service, tribute, attendance at court, and ritual obedience. There were said to be 71 of these domains at the start, and 53 went to men of the royal surname. It worked beautifully for about 2 centuries, and then it worked less and less well for the 8 centuries after that, for the reason you have probably already spotted. A king's brother feels bound to the king. His son feels bound to his cousin. His grandson has a great uncle he never met and a domain of his own with its own soldiers and its own harvest, and the ceremonies at the distant royal court begin to feel like an expensive nuisance. The Zhou spent the whole of their extraordinary length, the longest of any dynasty that land ever had, slowly leaking authority to their own relations. But while it worked, it produced something we can still touch, and it is quieter and lovelier than a battle. The Zhou kept casting bronze vessels, and they did something the Shang almost never did. They wrote on them at length. Where a Shang bronze carries a name or a clan sign, a Zhou bronze can carry hundreds of characters cast into the inside of the bowl, a full account of why it was made. And these are not poems. They are, overwhelmingly, receipts. A lord records that on such a day, in such a month, the king summoned him to the great hall, and the king's attendant led him in to stand facing north, and the king ordered the scribe to read out a charge, and the charge appointed him to supervise the royal herds, or the fields of a certain district, or the archers of the guard. And the king gave him a jade tablet, a set of robes with a red apron, a bronze bridle ornament, and a bow. And he bowed and touched his head to the ground, and dared to praise the king's goodness, and he made this vessel for his father. And may his sons and grandsons treasure it forever. Hundreds of those survive. They are the civil service records of a kingdom 3,000 years old. Written on the inside of soup cauldrons because the inside of a cauldron does not burn or rot, and because putting it there meant the ancestors could read it too. One of them, a long one, tells us that a man went to law against a superior over the ownership of 5 fields and some slaves, and lost. And the court's judgment was cast in bronze so that nobody could argue about it later. That is a property dispute from 28 centuries ago, preserved because somebody wanted the last word permanently. Another on a vessel found in a farmer's field in the 1960s records that the king moved into the new eastern city and addressed the young nobles of the royal clan, telling them to be worthy of their fathers. It contains 4 characters that read, partway through that address, as the central states. It is the oldest surviving instance of the phrase that would eventually become the country's name for itself. Their central states. The Middle Kingdom. Written on a wine vessel by a man being told to live up to his family, and then buried. And then plowed up 3,000 years later, a few miles from where it was cast. The Joe also built a world of rules, and the rules are worth a moment because they became the skeleton of everything. Rank was expressed in objects and quantities. A king might use 9 cauldrons at a ceremony, a great lord 7, a lesser lord 5, an officer 3, a gentleman 1. The number of dancers in your courtyard, the size of your coffin, the height of your wall, the pitch of the bells you were allowed to hang, the animals you might offer, the roads you might use, all of it was fixed by rank, and all of it was public. That sounds stifling, and it was. But it also meant something important. Power was supposed to be visible and bounded. When, centuries later, a lord in a border state started using 8 rows of dancers in his courtyard instead of the 6 his rank permitted, a certain teacher heard about it and said that if this can be tolerated, what cannot be tolerated? He was not being fussy about choreography. He was watching the frame come apart. It came apart in the 8th century before the Common Era. And the story of how is one of those tales that is too neat to be true and too good to leave out. The king of the day, they say, had a favorite consort who never smiled. Nothing amused her. He tried everything. And then one day, by accident, the beacon towers along the western frontier were lit, and the lords of the domains came racing in from every direction with their chariots and their levies, dust and shouting and panic, only to find no enemy at all and the king at his ease. And she laughed. So he lit them again and again. And the lords came more slowly each time and then stopped coming. And when the western tribes did at last come through the passes in earnest, the fires were lit and the horizon stayed empty, and the king was killed at the foot of a mountain, and the western capital was sacked and burned. Historians will tell you, correctly, that this is almost certainly a later moral fable, that the beacon system may not have existed in that form yet, and that the real causes were a disputed succession, a set of alienated in-laws who invited the tribesmen in themselves, and a long, slow drying of the climate that had been hurting the western harvests for decades. They are right. And yet the story survived because everybody in that culture understood exactly what it was about, which is that trust is a resource, that a ruler spends it every time he calls for help he does not need, and that it does not grow back on demand. The surviving heir was taken east to the second capital, out on the plain, and set on the throne there. He kept the title he kept the ceremony. He kept the right to confer legitimacy, and for the next 500 years, the lords of the domains went on going through the motions of receiving it because it was useful to them. What he no longer kept was land, revenue, or an army worth the name. The royal domain shrank until it was smaller than several of the states that nominally served it. And the king became a kind of sacred fixture that everybody needed and nobody feared. The historians of that country divide what follows into two long ages, and they named them after books. The first they called the Spring and Autumn, after a terse year-by-year chronicle kept by one of the eastern states, a document so laconic that a typical entry reads that in the third month it snowed. And a man died, and there was a locust plague. 3 centuries of that. The second they called the Warring States, after a later collection of diplomatic anecdotes, and the name is a fair summary of the contents. Between them they cover more than 500 years, and they are the most creative and most murderous stretch in the whole 4,000, and the two facts are related. Start with the first age. There are, at the beginning, well over 100 states on the map. Some are large. Many are a walled town, its fields, and a lord with a genealogy. Over 300 years, that 100 and more becomes a dozen or so that matter, by the simple arithmetic of the strong absorbing the weak, and the process was so normal that the chronicles record it the way a farmer records weather. Because the king could no longer keep order, the strongest lord of any given generation took to doing it in his name. He would summon the others to a meeting. They would swear an oath over the blood of a sacrificed animal, smearing it on their lips, and he would be acknowledged as the one who leads. In exchange, he was supposed to protect the smaller states, punish anyone who attacked them, keep the roads open, and defend the whole civilized zone against the peoples outside it. The first and best of these was the lord of a large eastern state on the coast, salt-rich and prosperous, and his success was almost entirely due to a minister who had once been on the other side of a civil war and had in fact personally shot an arrow at him. The arrow hit a belt buckle. The lord, on being advised that this man was the finest administrator alive, decided to overlook it, which is a level of professional detachment worth pausing on. The minister reorganized the state from the ground up. He divided the population into districts by occupation, so that soldiers lived among soldiers, and craftsmen among craftsmen, and sons learned their father's work without moving. He took the salt pans and the iron under state control and taxed the trade rather than the farmer. He standardized weights. He built up a grain reserve to level prices between good years and bad, buying when it was cheap and selling when it was dear, which is an idea that governments would keep rediscovering and congratulating themselves on for the next 25 centuries. And he said something that got written down and never forgotten, that when the granaries are full, people understand ceremony. And when they have enough clothing and food, they understand honor and disgrace. That is a sentence with a great deal packed into it. It says that virtue is downstream of dinner. It is the founding text of a whole practical school of governance in that country, and it sat in permanent, productive tension with the moralists who insisted that a ruler should be good first and prosperous second. Under those two men, the eastern state became the arbiter of the whole system, and when the northern tribes overran a small state and drove its survivors across the river, it was that lord who resettled them, gave them carts and horses and grain and sheep, and rebuilt their walls. He was, for about 40 years, the closest thing to an international order the region had. Then he died, badly, in a palace struggle among his own sons, his body left unburied in a sealed room for 67 days until the worms came out under the door, which is the sort of detail those chroniclers included without comment, and which does rather undercut the dignity of the office. The leadership passed around after him to a northern state under a lord who had spent 19 years in exile wandering between courts as a penniless prince before coming home at 62 to take the throne and win the greatest battle of the age within 4 years. To a southern power on the long river that the northerners regarded as barbarian and that regarded itself as a kingdom in its own right, whose rulers had cheerfully used the royal title for generations, arguing that they were not part of that system anyway, and to two remarkable states at the very edge of the world far down in the wet southeast, who fought each other with a viciousness that produced more proverbs than any other feud in the language. One of their kings was defeated and taken captive and made to serve as a groom in his enemy's stables. On being released, he went home and, so the story goes, slept on brushwood and hung a gallbladder above his seat and tasted its bitterness every day for years, so that he would never forget, while quietly rebuilding, and then destroyed the state that had humbled him. To sleep on brushwood and taste gall. It is still a live phrase in that language, meaning to endure hardship deliberately in order to come back. It is roughly 2,500 years old, and people use it in conversation. The other thing those centuries produced was a revolution in the fields, and it changed the terms of everything. Iron arrived. Not gradually, but with a particular twist. The iron workers in that country learned early to build furnaces hot enough to melt iron completely and pour it into molds rather than merely softening it and hammering it. Cast iron, in other words, roughly 1,800 years before it was done in Europe. The reason is partly that they had inherited a mature high-temperature ceramic and bronze casting industry, and partly the local coal, and partly a double-acting bellows that pushed air on both strokes. Cast iron is brittle, so it is bad for swords. It is excellent for plowshares, hoes, spades, axles, and cauldrons. They made those by the 100,000 in state foundries. And they cast them in reusable molds, which is mass production. At the same time, the ox was put in front of the plow. There are men from that era whose personal names combine the character for ox and the character for plow, which is the kind of accidental evidence historians treasure. An iron plow pulled by an ox can turn heavy ground that a wooden stick cannot scratch. Suddenly land that had been useless was farmland. Marsh could be drained, forest cleared, hillside terraced, population climbed. And the old system of land tenure quietly died. Under the ideal Joe arrangement, land was held from the Lord and worked in common, with a share going up the chain. There is a lovely, almost certainly idealized description of a square of land divided into 9 plots like a grid. 8 families, each farming one, and all of them together farming the 9th for the Lord. Once peasants could open new fields on their own initiative, out beyond the surveyed squares, that scheme became a fiction. States began simply taxing land by area, which meant surveying it, which meant registering the people on it, which meant a bureaucracy. So, more food, more people, more land, more revenue, more soldiers. And a state that now knew its subjects by name and could reach them directly rather than through a lord. Every one of those changes made war bigger. And into the middle of all this walked an unemployed teacher from a small, weak, deeply traditional eastern state, who had failed to obtain the government post he wanted, and who spent his later years traveling from court to court with a few dozen students being politely turned down. He was born about 25 centuries ago in a minor state on the Eastern Plain, to a family that had once been noble and was no longer anything much. His father died when he was very young. He grew up poor, and he said later, without embarrassment, that because he was poor when he was young, he had learned to do a great many humble things well. He worked as a keeper of granaries and then as a supervisor of livestock, and he was apparently good at both, which does not usually feature in the portraits. What he loved was the past. Not the past in general, but one specific stretch of it, the early Zhou, the age of the regent uncle who gave the throne back, when, as he understood it, everybody had known their place and their duties, the ceremonies had been performed properly, and the world had held together. Whether that age had ever actually existed in the form he imagined is doubtful. It did not matter. He had a picture of a working society, and he set out to explain what had made it work so that it could be rebuilt. His answer was not law, and it was not force, and it was not, in the end, even ritual, though ritual was the visible part. His answer was character. He thought a state was a very large household, and that both ran on the same fuel. If the man at the top genuinely cultivated himself, the people below him would be drawn to imitate him without needing to be threatened. Govern them by regulations and punishments, he said, and they will avoid the punishments and have no sense of shame. Govern them by virtue and by ceremony, and they will have a sense of shame and correct themselves. He was asked what he would do first if he were given a state to run, and he answered that he would rectify names. His student thought this was absurdly impractical and said so. And he explained, if names are not correct, language is not in accordance with the truth of things. If language is not in accordance with the truth of things, affairs cannot be carried on to success, and if affairs cannot be carried on to success, ceremony and music do not flourish. And if those do not flourish, punishments will not be properly awarded, and if punishments are not properly awarded, the people do not know where to put hand or foot. Which is to say, if a ruler is not really ruling, but is still called a ruler, and a father is not really being a father, but is still called a father, then everything downstream of those words is rotten, and no amount of administration will fix it. That is either a profound insight into how societies decay or an elaborate way of complaining about your employers, and honestly, it can be both at once. Sitting under the whole of his teaching was a quality he named with a character built from the mark for a person beside the mark for the number 2. 2 people. It is usually translated as benevolence or humaneness, and it means roughly what a person is like when they are being properly human in the presence of another person. Asked to define it, he gave different answers on different days, tailored to whoever was asking, which is itself the lesson. To one student, he said it was to love others. To another, who was impulsive, he said it was to be cautious in speech. To another, he gave the sentence that has been carved on 100,000 walls since, do not impose on others what you yourself do not desire. And when a student asked whether there was one word that could serve as a rule of practice for all of one's life, he said yes, and the word he chose meant something like reciprocity, or putting yourself in another's position. He was not, in any sense that a modern reader would recognize, religious. Asked about serving the spirits, he said that while one is not yet able to serve people, how can one serve spirits? Asked about death, he said that while one does not yet understand life, how can one understand death? He kept the ancestral ceremonies scrupulously, and he declined absolutely to speculate about what lay beyond them. That is a stance worth noticing, and it set the tone of educated life there for 2,000 years, intensely serious about ritual, intensely uninterested in metaphysics. He also, and this is the part that reshaped a civilization, taught anybody. The old education was for the sons of lords. He said that in teaching there should be no class distinctions. And he took students who arrived with nothing but a bundle of dried meat as a token payment. He had, they say, 3,000 of them over his life, and 72 who really understood him. What he was doing was manufacturing a new kind of person, not a warrior aristocrat, not a peasant, but a cultivated man of no particular birth who was qualified to advise a ruler because he had studied. He had a word for that person, an old word for the son of a lord, and he simply redefined it to mean the son of a good man, and then to mean a good man full stop. A gentleman in his usage is somebody who behaves like one. That redefinition created the class that would run that empire until the beginning of the last century. His own career was a failure, and he knew it. He got a real post at last in his home state, rose to something like Minister of Justice, and lost it within a few years when the Lord he served accepted a gift of 80 dancing girls and 80 horses from a rival state and stopped attending to business for 3 days. He left at about 55 and spent the next 13 years on the road with his students, going from court to court, being received courteously and employed nowhere. He was nearly starved in one state and threatened in another. He was mistaken for a criminal and detained for 5 days. A hermit he passed on the road told his driver that the whole world was a rushing torrent and asked whether it would not be better to withdraw from it altogether. And when this was reported to him, he said, with something like sadness, that one cannot associate with birds and beasts, and that if the world were already in order, he would not be trying to change it. He went home at last, at about 68, and taught and edited the old books, and his favorite student died, and then his son died, and then another beloved student died, and he said that heaven was destroying him. He died at 72, and his students built huts by his grave and stayed there for 3 years, and one stayed for 6. He had held no great office, he had reformed no state, he had converted no ruler. Within 300 years, his ideas were the intellectual furniture of a serious young man's mind. Within 400, they were the official doctrine of an empire. For the following 2,000 years, the road into government service in that country ran through examinations on the books associated with his name, which means that for most of recorded history, the largest bureaucracy on earth was staffed by people selected for how well they had absorbed the opinions of an unemployed teacher who could not get a job. His conversations were written down by his students and by his students' students in short fragments with no arrangement, and that collection is the closest thing to a canonical book that tradition has. It is a strange text. It has no argument and no order. It opens with a line about the pleasure of learning and having friends come from far away, and then wanders through remarks about music, morning, horses, ginger, the correct way to sit, and whether a certain man was a good administrator. There are moments in it that catch you completely off guard. He was asked about a man who had been unjustly imprisoned and gave him his own daughter in marriage. He said of a favorite student who lived on a single bowl of rice and a gourd of water in a mean alley, that others could not have borne it, but that the young man's cheerfulness never altered. When he heard music of a certain quality in a foreign state, he did not notice the taste of meat for 3 months. He said that at 15 he set his heart on learning, at 30 he stood firm, at 40 he had no doubts, at 50 he knew the decrees of heaven, at 60 his ear was obedient, and at 70 he could follow what his heart desired without overstepping the line. That last sentence is the whole program in 20-odd words. The goal is not to obey the rules. The goal is to become the sort of person for whom the rules and the desires have quietly become the same thing. He would have hated the temples that were later built to him. He said explicitly that he was a transmitter and not a maker, that he loved the ancients and trusted them, and he would have found the sacrifices offered to his own spirit both embarrassing and, worse, incorrect. But he was not the only one talking, and he was not even in his own lifetime the most listened to. The centuries after him were the loudest, most argumentative, most philosophically fertile period that country ever had, and later ages gave it a name that translates as the 100 schools of thought. There were not 100. There were perhaps a dozen that lasted and a few that mattered enormously, and they were arguing about a single question that the collapse of the old order had made urgent. The question was, what actually holds people together now that birth and ceremony have stopped doing it? The teacher we have just spent time with said, cultivated character radiating downward from a good ruler. The next voice said something almost opposite, and it came from someone who had trained in that school and walked out of it in disgust. He thought the ceremonies were a scandal. Look at what they cost, he said. Look at the 3 years of mourning that takes a man out of useful work. Look at the musicians and the bells and the elaborate funerals in a country where people are starving. He proposed instead a doctrine of universal care, that one should be concerned for every person equally, not more for one's own father than for a stranger's father, and that every practice and institution should be judged by one plain test, whether it increases the wealth of the state, the number of the people, and good order. His followers were not scholars in libraries. They were an organized, disciplined body under an elected master, and they had a specialism. They were the finest defensive engineers alive, and when a small state was about to be attacked by a large one, they would arrive uninvited and organize the defense, because they were against offensive war on principle. There is a story about their founder hearing that a great southern kingdom was building siege ladders to attack a small neighbor. He walked for 10 days and 10 nights to get there. He was granted an audience with the engineer who had designed the ladders and asked to demonstrate. They took a belt and laid it on a table as a city wall and used small wooden sticks as the machines, and played out the siege 9 times. 9 times the engineer attacked, and 9 times he was repelled, and at the end the engineer said he knew how to defeat him, but would not say. And the philosopher answered that he knew what he meant, which was to kill him, and would not say that either, and added that 300 of his students were already on the walls of that city, and that killing one man would not help. The attack was called off. That school was enormously influential for 200 years, and then vanished so completely that its text nearly did not survive, and its disappearance is among the great unexplained events in that intellectual history. Then there is the other current, and that one ran deepest and lasted longest in the private lives of the people who publicly followed the moralists. Its founding book is short. It is about 5,000 characters in 81 brief sections, half of them in verse, and it is attributed to an archivist at the royal court who grew weary of the world, so the story runs, and mounted a water buffalo, and rode west towards the mountain passes to leave the civilized country altogether. The keeper of the pass recognized him and refused to let him through until he wrote his teaching down. So he sat and wrote it, and then he went through the pass, and nobody ever heard of him again. Almost certainly he never existed. The book is a compilation. It does not matter in the slightest. What it says is that there is a way things go, an unnameable pattern underneath everything, and that the more energetically you try to grasp it, name it, improve on it, and enforce it, the further you get from it. Its central practical instruction is a phrase meaning something like acting without forcing, not idleness, but the kind of action that goes with the grain rather than against it. As water finds its own path downhill and eventually cuts through the rock that seemed to stop it, it is full of images that get under your skin. 30 spokes share one hub, and it is the empty hole at the center that makes the wheel useful. Clay is shaped into a pot, and the emptiness inside is what you actually use. Doors and windows are cut for a room, and the space is what you live in. Nothing in the world is softer than water, it says, and yet nothing is better at wearing down what is hard. And it has a political program, though it is easy to miss under the poetry, and the program is, do less. The more prohibitions there are, the poorer the people become. The more laws are promulgated, the more thieves there are. The best ruler is one whose existence the people barely notice, and when the work is done, they say that it happened naturally. Rulers, it must be said, found this less compelling than the alternatives. The other great voice in that current was a very different animal, a witty, slippery, gorgeously funny writer who used stories rather than aphorisms. He is the one who dreamt he was a butterfly, drifting happily about, and woke up and could not decide whether he was a man who had dreamt he was a butterfly or was now a butterfly dreaming he was a man. He is also the one who wrote about the cook cutting up an ox whose blade had gone 19 years without being sharpened, because he did not cut through anything. He found the spaces that were already there and let the knife pass along them. And when a great state sent officials to offer him high office, he was fishing and did not turn around, and asked them whether it was true that their kingdom kept a sacred tortoise, dead 3,000 years, wrapped in cloth and stored in a basket in the ancestral temple. They said it was, and he asked whether that tortoise would rather be dead and honored in a basket or alive and dragging its tail in the mud. They said alive, obviously, dragging it through the mud. And he said, "Go away. I intend to go on dragging my tail in the mud." Between the moralists and the mystics, a great many other people were saying a great many different things. There was a school of logicians who spent their time on paradoxes and are chiefly remembered for an argument that a white horse is not a horse, which annoyed everyone. There were agriculturalists who thought the ruler ought to plow alongside the peasants. There were specialists in the interaction of the two great complementary forces and the 5 phases of matter, whose system of correspondences would end up underlying medicine, cooking, city planning, and a calendar for the next 2,000 years. And there were 2 more schools that changed the actual course of events, and they were the practical ones. The first wrote about war. There is a short book from that period, about 6,000 characters, attributed to a general from one of those southeastern states, and it is unlike anything written about war anywhere else at that date. It is not a chronicle of battles. It is not heroic. It contains no gods and almost no praise of courage. It begins by saying that war is a matter of vital importance to the state, the province of life and death, the road to survival or ruin, and that it must be studied thoroughly. And then it says in effect that the whole thing is a mistake and your job is to win with as little of it as possible. To subdue the enemy without fighting is the highest skill. The best policy is to attack the enemy's strategy. The next best is to break his alliances. The next is to attack his army. And the worst of all is to besiege a walled city, which you should do only when there is no alternative, because it will take months and consume your force. It is obsessed with information and with deception. Know the enemy and know yourself, and you will not be endangered in 100 battles. All warfare is based on deception. It is obsessed with logistics and with the tempo of a campaign. And it says plainly that no country has ever benefited from a prolonged war. It reads 25 centuries later, less like a military manual than like a cold, clear meditation on how to get what you want without breaking everything, which is why it turns up on the shelves of people who have never held a weapon. And the second practical school had no poetry in it at all. Its thinkers looked at the moralists and found them ridiculous. People are not good, they said. People pursue their own advantage, always, and a system that depends on rulers being virtuous will collapse the moment an ordinary man inherits the throne, which will be most of the time. And ceremony is nostalgia. The ancient sages faced different conditions. A farmer who sits by a tree stump waiting for another rabbit to run into it because one did once is not being traditional. He is being a fool. So build a machine that does not need good people. Write the laws down. Publish them so everybody knows them. Apply them identically to the great and the humble, so that punishment does not spare the powerful and reward does not skip the obscure. Make the rewards rich enough to be worth chasing and the punishments severe enough that nobody chances it. Then direct every incentive at the two activities that make a state strong, which are farming and fighting, and remove the rewards from everything else, especially from talking. It was cold, it was brutal, it worked terrifyingly well, and one state adopted it wholesale. The state that adopted it sat out west, in the valley of a tributary river behind mountains, on the ground where the Joe themselves had begun before they moved east and got civilized. Its name was Kin. The eastern states looked down on it thoroughly. They said it had the customs of the tribes beyond the frontier. They said its people were rough and its court had no manners and its lords did not understand ceremony. They excluded it for a long time from the covenants of the civilized zone, which was a serious insult and, as insults go, an expensive one. The Kin had two enormous advantages and did not at first know what to do with them. The first was geography. Their heartland was a broad, fertile basin, closed on every side by mountains and gorges, entered by a small number of passes that a modest force could hold. They could come out east whenever they liked, down through the passes, onto the plain, and nobody could easily come in after them. For 400 years, wars happened to other people's farmland. The second was that being on the frontier, they had been fighting mounted peoples for generations. And they had a hard military culture and horses and no illusions. What they lacked was administration, and in the 4th century before our era, a young ruler advertised for talent, offering land and office to anybody from anywhere who could make his state strong. A minor nobleman from a small central state answered the advertisement. He had studied law and administration, been ignored at home, and arrived in the West with a set of ideas and no sentiment whatsoever. He was granted an audience. He talked about the path of the ancient sage kings, and the ruler fell asleep. He came back and talked about the conduct of a virtuous king, and the ruler was bored. He came back a third time and talked about how to make a state overwhelmingly powerful within a single generation, and the ruler leaned forward, and they talked for 3 days without either of them getting tired. The reforms he then enacted are among the most thorough ever imposed on any society. He abolished the hereditary aristocracy's automatic privileges. From then on, rank in the state came in 20 grades, and you rose through them by one route above all, military merit counted precisely. A noble with no achievements had no standing. He broke up the extended household. Any family with 2 adult sons living together and not divided paid double tax, which forced the great clans apart into small units the state could count and tax individually. He organized the whole population into groups of 5 and 10 families mutually responsible. If one member committed an offense and the others did not report it, they were all punished. If they did report it, they were rewarded as if they had captured an enemy. He fixed the price and status of everything. Farmers who produced a surplus of grain or cloth were exempted from labor service. Merchants and innkeepers were taxed heavily and their sons conscripted, because trade was considered a parasitic activity that drew people away from the fields. He abolished the old field boundaries and let land be bought and sold and taxed by area. He standardized weights and measures across the state, and a bronze measuring vessel with his edict cast into it survives. And it is a mundane object that changed more lives than most battles, and he insisted, above everything, that the law be certain. To prove it, when he first published the new code, he had a pole set up at the south gate of the market and announced that anybody who carried it to the north gate would receive 10 pieces of gold. Nobody moved, because it was obviously a trick. He raised it to 50. One man, presumably with nothing to lose, picked up the pole and carried it across the market, and was immediately paid 50 pieces of gold in public. The point was not the pole. The point was that the state now said what it meant. Shortly afterwards, the heir to the throne broke a law. He could not be punished, so his tutor was, and the tutor's face was tattooed, and another advisor lost his nose. Nobody in that state doubted the code again. The reformer served for 19 years, and the state's revenue and army swelled beyond anything its neighbors could match. And when his patron died, the heir he had humiliated came to the throne, and the great families he had stripped of privilege accused him, and he fled. He arrived at an inn at night and asked for a room. And the innkeeper told him that under the law of the land, nobody may be lodged without documents, and that the penalty for the innkeeper would be severe. He is supposed to have said at that moment that he had not known his own laws had come to this. He was caught and torn apart between chariots, and his family was executed with him. But the machine he built was not dismantled, because it worked, and the men who killed him wanted it. That is the whole lesson of the age in one biography. Meanwhile, war itself had changed out of recognition, and it repays a moment to understand what it had become, because it explains the desperation that followed. In the earlier age, war between the domains had been an aristocratic affair. Nobles fought from chariots, in the summer, in a set place, by rules. There is a famous engagement in which one lord waited for his enemy to finish crossing a river and form up before attacking, on the grounds that a gentleman does not strike the unprepared, and lost, and was mocked for it forever afterwards, which tells you exactly when that world ended. By the later age, it was mass infantry. Peasants, conscripted by register, drilled in units, armed from state arsenals with mass-produced bronze and iron. Campaigns lasting years, armies numbering, if the sources are even half right, hundreds of thousands. The crossbow arrived with a bronze trigger mechanism of real precision, made to interchangeable tolerances in state workshops. It required no lifetime of training. A conscript could be taught to use one in a week, and it would go through armor at 200 paces. That single device did as much as any philosophy to end the aristocracy, because it made the expensively trained noble archer irrelevant. Cavalry arrived too, properly, when a northern king forced his court to abandon the long robes of the civilized states and adopt the trousers and short tunics of the horsemen of the grasslands over furious objections that it was undignified. It was undignified. It also worked, and walls went up everywhere. Every state on the northern frontier built long ramparts of rammed earth against the mounted peoples, and the states also built them against each other, hundreds of miles of them snaking along ridge lines. The scale of state action becomes hard to imagine. One state cut a canal through the mountains to link two river systems. Another built an irrigation works on a wild river in the southwest that is the most extraordinary engineering project of the ancient world that nobody outside that country has heard of. That last one deserves its moment. A river came down out of the high mountains into a flat basin, and every year it flooded. And in the dry season, the basin had no water at all. A governor and his son were given the problem. They could not dam it. The silt would fill any reservoir. So they split it. They built an artificial island in midstream, shaped like a fish's mouth, that divided the flow in two, the outer channel taking the bulk of the water and the sediment away down the old course, the inner channel drawn off towards the plain. Then they had to get the inner channel through a rocky ridge, and they had no iron tools capable of it and no explosives. So they heated the rock with fire and quenched it with water until it cracked over and over for 8 years, until they had cut a gap 20 meters wide. And then they added the thing that makes it genius, a spillway between the two channels at exactly the right height, so that in flood the excess water in the inner channel pours back over into the outer one automatically. And the vortex there flings the heavy sediment out with it. There is no dam, nothing to break. It regulates itself. They laid down a maintenance rule as well: dig the channel deep, keep the spillway low, and once a year in the dry season dredge back down to a set of stone markers buried in the riverbed. That system was finished around 250 years before our era. It has been in continuous operation ever since, for more than 22 centuries, and it still irrigates the basin today, and the basin it waters became the richest agricultural region in the country and the granary that fed the wars of unification. The state that built it was kin. They had taken that basin by conquest a generation earlier. And turning it into a breadbasket was the deliberate strategy of a government that thought in decades. That is the pattern you should keep in your mind as we go into the last act. Everybody else was fighting for advantage in the next campaign. One state in the West was quietly building the physical and administrative foundation for something none of the others had imagined. By the closing century of that long age there were 7 serious powers left, and the diplomacy between them had become a full profession, with traveling strategists who went from capital to capital, selling grand alignments. The two great rival schemes were to bind the 6 eastern states into a north-south alliance against the West, or for the West to pick them off by cutting private bargains east and west one at a time. The second scheme won, as it usually does, because 6 governments that distrust each other cannot hold a line against one that does not. And then, halfway through that century, a hostage prince from Qin, who had been left in an enemy capital as a diplomatic pledge, in poor circumstances and with no expectations, was noticed by a very rich merchant. The merchant, according to the historian who tells the story, went home and asked his father what the profit was on farming, and was told it was 10-fold, and what on jewels, and was told 100-fold, and what the return would be on establishing a ruler and securing a state. And his father said it would be beyond calculation. So he invested in the prince. He spent his own fortune on him, bought him clothes and a following, traveled to the western capital, and lobbied the favorite consort of the heir, who was childless, until she adopted the young man as her son and had him named successor. The old king died. The heir died after 3 days on the throne, which was convenient. The hostage prince became king, and the merchant became chancellor. And the boy who came with that prince out of the eastern capital, born in exile in the enemy city, would take the throne himself at 13 and become the first emperor of a unified country. There has been gossip ever since that the merchant was actually his father, and that the pregnancy was already underway when he arranged the marriage. The historian who recorded it clearly enjoyed the story. It is unprovable and probably slander, and it says more about how much later scholars loathe the man than about his parentage. He was a regent's ward until he was 21, and then, in a single year, he broke the regency in a way that told everybody what sort of ruler he intended to be. There was a revolt in the palace by a favorite of his mother's, who had raised a private army and, remarkably, had 2 sons by her, whom he seems to have intended to put on the throne. The young king put it down without hesitation, executed the man and the children, exiled his mother, forced the merchant chancellor into retirement, and then, when the man kept receiving visitors from foreign states, sent him a letter asking coldly what services he had ever rendered. The chancellor drank poison. The king was now alone at the top at 22. And a purge of foreign advisers was proposed by the old Qin nobility, and it was blocked by a single memorandum from a man who stood to lose his own post by it. That memorandum ranks among the finest short arguments in the language. It listed, one after another, the outsiders who had made that state great: the reformer, the strategists, the engineers, and pointed out that the ruler's own jade came from other states, and his horses from the north, and his ivory from the south, and his music from the east, and asked whether he intended to reject those too. If you will use foreign things and refuse foreign men, it said, then you value jewels and music above people, and this is not how one rules the world. The purge was canceled. The man who wrote it became the chief minister of the unification and the architect of almost everything that followed. Then came the wars, and they were relentless and they were fast. Over 10 years, from about 230 before our era, the 6 eastern kingdoms fell one after another. The nearest and weakest first. Then the great northern military state, whose best general was destroyed not on the battlefield, but by bribed courtiers who convinced their own king he was plotting, an old trick that keeps working. Then the tiny state that tried to solve the problem by sending an assassin. That episode is the most famous few minutes in that country's history. The assassin came as an envoy, carrying two things the king of Qin badly wanted: a map of the territory his state was offering to surrender, rolled up in a case, and in a box, the head of a fugitive general with a price on it. He was admitted to the audience hall. He unrolled the map along the table, slowly, for the king to read, and at the very end of the roll lay a dagger. He grabbed the king's sleeve and struck. The sleeve tore. The king ran, trying to draw his own sword, which was ceremonially long and would not come out of the scabbard while he was moving. The courtiers in the hall were forbidden by law to carry weapons and could only shout. The palace guards were by that same law forbidden to enter the hall without a direct summons. And in the noise, nobody gave one. So the two men ran around a pillar. A physician threw his medicine bag at the assassin. Somebody shouted at the king to push the scabbard behind him and draw over his shoulder. He did, and it worked, and that was the end of it. The state that had sent him was erased within months, its king hunted down and killed by his own people in the hope of mercy that did not come. Then the vast southern kingdom on the long river, which took 600,000 men and a year. Then the last two. And in the year 221 before our era, for the first time, everything from the northern steppe to the southern rivers, from the western passes to the eastern sea, answered to one government. He was 38 years old, and he decided that the title of king was no longer sufficient because there were no longer any other kings. So he took the words used for the mythical august ones and divine rulers of the deep past and welded them into a new title, one that had never been used by a living man. And that word is usually translated as emperor. He declared himself the first and announced that his descendants would be the second and the third and so on for 10,000 generations. That prediction was wrong by a wide margin. Almost everything else he did outlasted him by 2,000 years. His chief minister proposed, and he agreed, that the empire would not be divided into domains for his sons. That system had produced 8 centuries of war. Instead, the whole territory was cut into 36 commanderies, each with a civil governor, a military commander, and an inspector reporting separately to the capital, all appointed, all paid, all transferable, none hereditary. That is a professional bureaucracy administering a territorial empire, and that is the template that country used, with modifications, until the 20th century. He moved 120,000 noble families from the conquered states to the capital, where they could be watched and where their local networks were worthless. He collected the bronze weapons of the defeated armies, had them melted, and cast 12 colossal statues for his palace, weighing, they say, many tons apiece. And then came the standardizations, and this is the quiet part that actually built a nation. The script. The 6 states had drifted into variant forms, so that a document from one was hard reading in another. His minister issued a single reformed standard, a clean, elegant, small seal script, and abolished the rest, and had a set of model texts published. Every character used in that country since descends from that decision. The weights and measures. One set for the empire, cast in bronze and iron, with the edict inscribed on them, distributed everywhere, so that a bushel was a bushel from the desert to the sea, and taxes could be assessed uniformly, and a merchant could not be robbed by arithmetic. The coinage. All the local knife-shaped and spade-shaped and shell-shaped money abolished, replaced by one round bronze coin with a square hole in the middle so it could be strung on a cord, That shape lasted for 2,000 years. The axle width of carts. This sounds absurd, and it is easily the most practical thing he ever did. In deep lowest country, wheels wear ruts, and the ruts become the road. And a cart with a different gauge cannot use them. Fixing one gauge for the empire meant that a wagon from anywhere could roll on any road anywhere. And the roads themselves. Straight imperial highways radiating from the capital, some of them 50 paces wide with trees planted along the sides, and a military road running north for hundreds of miles, cut and embanked through hill country. Built in a matter of years. He also, and here is the item everybody knows and almost everybody misunderstands, connected the walls. The northern states he had conquered had each built long earth ramparts against the mounted peoples of the grasslands. He sent his best general north with a very large army, cleared the frontier zone, and then set the soldiers and conscripted laborers to linking and extending those older walls into one continuous frontier work running for thousands of miles. It was not the wall you have seen in photographs. That one is stone and brick and 1,500 years younger and lies in a different place. His was rammed earth, layer on layer, beaten between boards by conscripted laborers in their hundreds of thousands, working in the cold with watchtowers and beacon stations and garrison forts strung along it. Almost none of it survives above ground. What survives is the memory of what it cost. There is a folk story told ever since about a woman whose husband was taken for the work and never came back, and who walked north for months carrying winter clothes for him and reached the wall and learned he was dead and buried in it and wept until a section collapsed and gave up the bones. That story is the counterweight to the achievement, and both parts are true at once. And the people of that country have held both in mind about that man for 22 centuries without ever quite resolving them. He traveled constantly, 5 great tours in 11 years, out to the sea in the east, down to the southern rivers, up the coast, back through the mountains, an emperor in perpetual motion across an empire that had never seen one. On the mountains he stopped at, he had stones cut and inscriptions carved, and several of those texts survive in copies. They are worth reading because they are not what you expect from a tyrant. They boast, certainly, but mostly they announce over and over that the killing has stopped. The weapons have been put away. The people may now farm in peace. Boundaries have been abolished and roads opened. Men and women behave properly, and the young are taught. Everything under heaven is one household, and the soldiers will not be raised again. He genuinely seems to have believed that he had ended history, and after 500 years of continuous war, it is not hard to see why he thought so. He also began, in his 40s, to be afraid of dying. That fear became the organizing principle of his last decade, and it is easily the strangest thing about him. A man of relentless practicality, who trusted law and measurement and engineering above all things, spent the end of his life funding an enormous search for a drug that would let him live forever. He sent expeditions to the Eastern Sea, where 3 holy islands were said to lie, inhabited by beings who had found the secret. One court magician told him the islands existed, but that great fish blocked the approach, and asked for archers and got them. Another was sent out with a fleet and several thousand young men and women, and never came back, and there is a legend in the islands off that coast that he landed there and settled. He consulted alchemists. He almost certainly consumed preparations containing cinnabar, which is a mercury ore, in the reasonable-sounding belief that a substance that never corrupts might pass its incorruptibility along. That would have poisoned him steadily. Tremors, confusion, paranoia, organ failure. The medicine of eternal life was, with a completeness that no novelist would dare invent, killing him. He began to conceal his movements. He built 270 palaces and pavilions around the capital and had them connected by covered and walled roads so that he could move between them unseen, and it became a capital offense to reveal where he was. He stopped being seen. And in the 34th year of his reign, at a banquet, a scholar stood up and told him that the empire would not last because he had abolished the old system of granting domains to his sons, and that no institution had ever endured that did not follow the ancients. His chief minister answered, and the answer changed the history of that country's libraries. He said that times change and that the scholars study the past in order to criticize the present, that they gather in private and disparage the law, that when an edict is issued, each of them discusses it according to his own school, and that this must stop. So it was ordered the historical records of all the conquered states burned. Private copies of the odes and the documents and the writings of the 100 schools surrendered within 30 days and burned. Anyone who quoted the old poetry to criticize the government, executed with his family. Anyone who praised antiquity to disparage the present, executed. Exempted. Books on medicine, on divination, and on agriculture and forestry. And one complete set of everything was kept in the imperial library. The next year, after 2 alchemists took his money, failed to produce the drug, and fled while insulting him behind his back, he had an inquiry made among the scholars of the capital, and they accused one another, and something over 460 were executed by burial. His eldest son objected to the severity and was sent north to the frontier army out of sight. That posting would decide everything. The burning is remembered as the great crime, and it was a crime. But the deeper damage came later, when the rebellion that ended his house burned the capital, and the one complete set held there went with it, and the exemption became meaningless. What survived of the old literature survived because scholars had memorized it, or because copies had been hidden in walls, and one of the great scholarly labors of the following century was old men reciting texts from memory to young men with brushes. Now let us go to the hill. About 20 miles east of his capital, at the foot of a mountain. He had been building his tomb since he was 13 years old. It was the standard practice. Every ruler began his tomb on accession. But he had 36 years and, after unification, the resources of the whole world. The record says 700,000 conscripts worked on it. The mound above it is still there, a flattened earthen pyramid rising out of the fields, planted now with pomegranate trees about 150 feet high after 2,000 years of weathering, and originally a good deal higher. What is under it has never been opened. The historian who wrote about it a century later says that the workmen dug down through 3 subterranean streams and poured molten bronze to seal the base, that the chamber was filled with models of palaces and offices and with treasures, that crossbows were rigged to fire on anyone who broke in, that the ceiling was set with pearls as the constellations and the floor laid out as a map of the empire, with the 100 rivers and the seas made of flowing mercury mechanically circulated, and whale oil lamps burning that were meant to burn forever. For a very long time this was assumed to be poetry. Then soil scientists ran systematic tests across the mound and found mercury concentrations in the earth many times higher than the surrounding countryside, distributed unevenly, and concentrated in a pattern that corresponds roughly to the geography of the empire's rivers and eastern sea. There are, in other words, quite good grounds for thinking that there is a map of a country made of liquid metal under that hill, and that it has been sitting there for 22 centuries. Nobody is digging it up. The considered position is that the excavation techniques do not yet exist to open it without destroying what is inside, and that a tomb that has waited 22 centuries can wait a little longer. Which brings us at last to the field to the east of the mound and to a very dry spring. In the spring of 1974, there had been a drought in that district, and a group of farmers from a local village set out to dig a well in a persimmon orchard about a mile from the great mound. They chose a spot and started down. At about 3 or 4 meters, they came into a layer of hard red-packed earth, harder than it should have been. Then a piece of fired clay. Then, as they went deeper, the top of a jar, except that it was not a jar. It was a head. They brought it up, and it was a man's head in terracotta, life-sized with a topknot and an expression of complete composure. Then they found shoulders. Then bronze arrowheads and fragments of a crossbow trigger and pieces of arms and torsos and floor tiles. The village had a certain amount of debate about this. Some thought the figures were temple gods and ought to be treated respectfully. Someone hung a cloth over one. Others were mainly concerned about the well. Word reached a local official who arranged for the pieces to be carted to the county museum, where a conservator spent months gluing figures back together. In the summer, a journalist visiting family in the area heard about it and wrote an internal report, and the report reached the capital. And an archaeological team was sent. They began to survey. The pit did not end. It measures about 230 meters by 62. It contains, by estimate, more than 6,000 figures arranged in 11 parallel corridors separated by walls of rammed earth, floored with brick, roofed with timber and matting, and covered over with soil, standing in battle order facing east. Then they found a second pit to the north with cavalry and chariots and kneeling archers, then a third, smaller, which appears to be the command post, then a fourth, empty, unfinished, abandoned when everything stopped. And the numbers kept climbing as the survey widened. The whole necropolis covers something like 22 square miles. There are pits with terracotta acrobats and strongmen, a pit with civil officials carrying riding knives and bamboo slips, a pit with bronze water birds, cranes and swans and geese standing along a watercourse with terracotta musicians seated to play to them, stables with real horse skeletons and terracotta grooms, 2 half-size bronze chariots, each with a driver and 4 horses made of thousands of parts, with harnesses of woven gold and silver wire and windows of fretted bronze that slide. But it is the soldiers that stop people, and it is worth being precise about why. They were made in parts by an assembly system, legs solid, torsos coiled and built hollow, arms and hands separate, heads separate, everything luted together with clay slip and fired in kilns at around 1,000 degrees. There were perhaps 10 basic head shapes. The workshops were organized in units, and 87 foremen's names are stamped or incised on the figures, along with the workshops they came from, because the quality control law of that state required the maker's name on the product. And then, after assembly and before firing, somebody worked on every single face by hand. The ears are individual. The eyebrows and mustaches were modeled separately and applied. The set of the mouth differs. Some are young and smooth. Some have lined foreheads and heavy jaws and the beginnings of a stoop. Some look bored. There is one figure whose expression is best described as long-suffering, and once you have seen it, you cannot unsee it. Nobody claims any more that they are portraits of real soldiers. That was an early romantic guess. What they are is stranger and, to me, better, a mass-produced army, in which the industrial process was deliberately interrupted at the last stage so that no two men would be the same. Somebody in that workshop decided that a uniform army would not do, that each of these figures had to read as a person, and the state paid for that decision 7,000 times over. They were painted, too, in strong colors. Pink faces, purple and green and blue and red robes and armor laces, black hair, brown eyes. The lacquer undercoat that held the pigment is mostly flaked in the ground, and what remains often curls and falls within minutes of exposure to dry air, so the excavation now proceeds under humidity control, and much of the site is deliberately left buried. The army you have seen in photographs, gray and solemn and stone-colored, is a stripped version of something that was once as bright as a parade. And they hold real weapons. Bronze swords, spearheads, arrowheads by the tens of thousands, cast to tolerances of a fraction of a millimeter and interchangeable between units. Some of them still bright after 22 centuries because the surface carries a chromium-bearing layer that has been argued about for 50 years. The whole thing faces east towards the 6 kingdoms he conquered, guarding a man who was afraid. He died on the road. It was his 5th tour in the Far East in high summer in the year 210 before our era. He was 49. Whatever was in the elixirs had finally finished its work, and he collapsed at a town on the plain, hundreds of miles from the capital, with only a small party of intimates around him. He dictated a letter to his eldest son on the northern frontier, telling him to bring the body back and conduct the funeral, which was, in that language, an instruction to take the throne. The letter was given to the chief eunuch of the seal office to send. It was not sent. That man had a grudge against the eldest son and had been tutor to a younger one, an unserious young man who was traveling with the party. He went to the chief minister, the great architect of the whole system, the one who had written the memorandum about foreign talent and standardized the script, and pointed out that under a new emperor who despised him he would be finished, and that under a boy he had helped to enthrone he would be indispensable. The minister was in his 70s. He had built everything. He agreed. They forged a new letter ordering the eldest son to take his own life and another condemning the general beside him. The son received it, wept, and obeyed at once. The general suspected forgery, demanded confirmation, was arrested and killed anyway. And then the party had to get the emperor's body home in August without anybody finding out he was dead. So they kept the imperial carriage curtained and continued the tour, and food was carried in and decisions announced as usual. And because the corpse in the heat began to be noticeable, they attached a cart of salted fish to the procession and ordered every carriage in the train to carry a load of it, so that the smell of the fish would cover the smell of the emperor. The man who had unified a continent, standardized its writing, and set 7,000 clay soldiers in the ground to guard him forever, went home to his tomb inside a moving wall of rotting fish. There is no moral to add to that. It supplies its own. The younger son took the throne as the second emperor and lasted 3 years. He executed his brothers and sisters. He continued the building programs at full speed and raised the labor levies. The eunuch became the real power and eventually turned on the old chief minister, who was arrested, tortured, and cut in half at the waist in the marketplace of the capital, and who is said to have turned to his son as they were led out and remarked that he wished the pair of them could go hunting hares outside the east gate again as they used to, and that it was no longer possible. The eunuch then murdered the second emperor as well, and put a nephew on the throne, and the nephew murdered the eunuch, and then the rebels arrived. It had begun in a rainstorm. A party of 900 conscripts was being marched to a garrison post in the south, and the rains came and washed out the roads, and they could not arrive on time. Under the law of that state, being late for a mustering meant death. Two of the junior officers, ordinary men, worked out that they were going to be executed for the weather, and that the penalty for rebellion was also death, and that therefore the choice was between certain execution and a chance. One of them asked the others, so the story goes, whether kings and nobles are born to their rank. They rose. Within weeks, the whole East was in revolt, because the resentments had been sitting there for a decade. The labor levies, the transported families, the abolished kingdoms, the conscription, the punishments. Nobles of the old destroyed states came out of hiding and raised their banners again. The empire that had been designed to last 10,000 generations came apart in the 14th year of its existence. Out of the wreckage, two men rose above the rest, and the contest between them is the great romance of that country's history, played out on chessboards ever since. The river dividing a standard board is still named for the boundary the two of them agreed, and one of them broke. The first was an aristocrat from the southern kingdom, a giant of a man, personally the most formidable soldier of the age, who won essentially every battle he fought. He crossed a river to attack a much larger force, and on landing sank his own boats and smashed the cooking pots so that his men would understand there was no way back, and destroyed the last Chinfield army in 9 engagements. The second was a village official from the east, of no family at all, middle-aged, fond of wine and of company, notably lazy, unable to fight, uninterested in ceremony, and possessed of one enormous talent. He could recognize ability in other people, listen to it, and give it room. The aristocrat took the capital and burned the palaces. And the fire in the imperial library is said to have burned for 3 months. He restored the old kingdoms and handed them out to his supporters and made himself their overlord, and sent the village official off to a poor province in the far west behind the mountains, expecting to hear nothing more from him. 4 years of war followed. The aristocrat won almost all of it and lost the last of it. He could not delegate. His best strategist left him and went to the other side, and so did his best general, and so did a good many others, because he was generous with praise and stingy with land. The village official gave away provinces to men who won in battles, listened to every piece of advice he was offered, broke agreements without visible embarrassment, and lost engagement after engagement while steadily gaining territory, allies, and supply. At the end, the aristocrat was surrounded at a place called the Loo Hill with a small remnant, and in the night he heard the songs of his own homeland being sung by the besieging troops in every direction, and understood that his whole country had gone over. He drank with his favorite and his horse in the tent, and sang a short song about strength that could uproot mountains and a time that was no longer with him, and rode out at dawn with 28 men, and cut his way through, and reached the river bank where a ferryman offered to take him across to safety in his native country to raise another army. He refused. He said that he had crossed that river with 8,000 sons of that country, and that not one of them was coming back, and that even if their fathers and brothers took pity on him and made him king again, he could not face them. He gave the ferryman his horse and turned around and died fighting on foot. He was 30. The village official became emperor, and the house he founded was called the Han, and it lasted, with one interruption, for 400 years, and its name is what the majority ethnic group of that country still uses for itself today. Han people. Han characters. Han language, a dynasty founded by a genial provincial constable, so completely became the definition of the culture that a fifth of humanity is still named after it. His first act as emperor is instructive. He had contempt for scholars. There is a story that he once took a scholar's ceremonial cap and urinated in it. But after the victory, his rough companions got drunk in the palace, shouted about their own achievements, quarreled, and started hacking at the pillars with their swords, and he found that he had no way to make them stop. So he sent for a scholar who devised a court ceremonial, drilled the veterans in it for a month, and staged a New Year audience with everybody in place by rank, moving on cue, nobody speaking out of turn. And the emperor, watching from the throne, said that only now did he understand how honorable it is to be an emperor. That is the moment the two great streams of that civilization merged. The machine built by the cold administrators, kept intact, with its commanderies and its registers and its standard weights, was fitted with the ceremonial and the moral vocabulary of the teachers. The law stayed. The scholars supplied the reasons. An emperor 2 centuries later put it plainly to his heir, who wanted to rely on the moralists alone. Our house has its own system, which mixes the method of the hegemon with the code of the true king. How could we depend on moral instruction only? The Han spent their first 60 years deliberately doing very little, and it was the wisest policy they ever adopted. The country was exhausted. The population had fallen. The chronicles say that at the founding the emperor could not find 4 horses of the same color to draw his carriage, and his chief ministers rode in ox carts. So the early Han court adopted the doctrine of acting without forcing, cut taxes to 1/30th of the harvest, reduced punishments, abolished the law that punished a criminal's whole family, left the merchants alone, and stayed out of foreign wars even under provocation. 2 emperors ruled that way for nearly 40 years between them, and the results became the standard against which every later period of good government in that country was measured. The granaries filled until the grain at the bottom rotted. The strings on the strung coins in the treasury rotted through so that the coins could not be counted. Ordinary villages kept horses, and it became embarrassing to arrive at a gathering riding a mare. Let us slow down here, because this is the calmest ground in the whole story, and it is worth walking across slowly. Take an ordinary morning somewhere on the Great Plain about 21 centuries ago. It is early autumn. The millet has been cut, and the stubble stands pale in the fields, and a thin mist is lying in the low ground between the villages, so that from a low bank the roofs seem to be floating. The air smells of straw and wood smoke, and the sharp green smell of hemp retting in a ditch. A farmhouse here is mud brick with a thatched roof and a beaten earth floor, 1 main room and a smaller one behind, a raised platform along 1 wall for sleeping, a stove built of clay in the corner with a flue that runs under that platform, so that the warmth of the cooking passes beneath the beds before it goes out through the wall. That arrangement is thousands of years old, and it is still in use in the north of that country today, and if you have ever slept on one, you will remember it for the rest of your life, because there is nothing else quite like lying down on a warm floor in a cold room. Outside the door, there is a small yard with a pig in it. There is a mulberry tree, because the household is required to plant mulberries and because the women reel silk. There are chickens. There is a well with a wooden frame and a counterweighted pole so that a full bucket comes up with almost no effort, which is a very old and very good idea. Breakfast is millet gruel. Nobody in that world is eating rice unless they live in the South. And nobody anywhere is eating anything fried, because the round-bottomed iron pan and the technique that goes with it are still centuries away. Food is boiled, steamed, roasted, or pickled. There is a bamboo steamer over the pot. There are salted vegetables in a jar buried to its neck in the cool earth by the north wall. The household has a set of tools that would have astonished their great-grandparents: an iron-tipped plow with a moldboard curve to turn the sod over rather than merely scratch it, a seed drill that opens the furrow, drops the grain, and covers it in a single pass behind an ox, and a rotary winnowing fan with a crank handle that separates chaff from grain by making a wind indoors on a still day. That last device would not be seen in Europe for something like 18 centuries. It is sitting in a shed in a village on a plain, and nobody there thinks it is remarkable at all. Now walk in to the capital. Its name meant long peace, and it was, for a time, probably the largest city on earth. It sat in the western basin behind the passes, walled in rammed earth, with 12 gates, each gate with 3 carriageways, the central one reserved for the emperor and used by nobody else, so that on an ordinary day the middle of every gateway stood empty while the traffic squeezed along either side of it, which is a fair image of how that whole society understood order. Inside, the city was laid out in wards, each ward walled and gated in its turn, with the gates closed at night and drums to mark the hours. There were 2 great markets, east and west, and they opened at noon when a drum was beaten and closed at sunset when a gong was struck, and the goods were arranged in rows by kind. And officials walked the rows, checking weights and registering transactions and collecting the tax. Stand in the market for a moment, because the noise of it is the sound of an empire working. There are stacks of bolted silk, plain and patterned and dyed. There is lacquerware, which is the luxury good of the age, wooden cups and trays and boxes coated in dozens of thin layers of sap from a particular tree. Each layer dried and polished before the next goes on, until the surface is glossy, waterproof, and light as a leaf, painted in red and black with curling clouds and birds. A single fine lacquer cup could cost as much as 100 bronze ones, and the state workshops that made them stamped the year, the workshop, and the names of the men responsible for each stage on the base. There is grain and salt from the state monopoly and iron tools from the state foundries. There is dried fish and pickled meat and river turtles. There are furs and horses brought down from the north and jade from the far west and glass beads that have come an unimaginable distance and that nobody can quite account for. There are also bronze mirrors polished on one face and cast on the other with dense patterns and, very often, a line of writing around the rim. Those inscriptions are one of the most charming things that century left behind, because they are almost all good wishes, mass-produced. May you have sons and grandsons. May your position be that of a high official. May you never forget one another. May you live as long as the hills and the rivers. Somebody bought that mirror as a present for somebody. It got buried with them. It came up out of the ground 2,000 years later, still carrying the wish. Behind the market, in the offices, men are writing on bamboo. Slips about a foot long, planed, smooth, written top to bottom in a single column of clerical script with a brush, then bound with silk cord into a roll that can be tied up and carried under an arm. A clerk carries a brush and an inkstone and a small knife at his belt, and the knife is not a weapon. It is for scraping off mistakes, which is why the phrase for an official in that age has a knife and a brush in it. Whole archives of those slips have come out of dry sand at frontier posts and out of waterlogged tombs in the South, duty rosters, grain receipts, medical prescriptions, legal statutes with their commentaries, letters home from soldiers on the wall asking for money and warm clothes and complaining with total universality about the food. One of them, from a soldier at a northwestern garrison, is a request that his family send socks. In the evening, the drums sound and the ward gates close and the lamps come on. They are bronze, some of them, and the finest is a famous one shaped as a kneeling servant holding the lamp out in one hand, her other arm raised so that the sleeve forms the chimney, and the smoke is drawn up through the hollow sleeve into the water-filled body of the figure, so that the soot does not blacken the room. Somebody designed that. Somebody sat in a workshop and thought carefully about smoke, and out in the countryside the year turns over as it has always turned. Plowing in the spring, the silkworms hatching when the mulberry leaves open, the frantic weeks of feeding them when the sound of a shed full of caterpillars eating is like steady rain. Weeding in the heat. Harvest, then the hemp cut and retted and spun, and the winter cloth woven by lamplight, and the taxes carried to the district office in grain and cloth and days of labor. There is a book of songs from centuries earlier that the scholars of that age had memorized and were busy over interpreting, and one of the songs is simply a calendar of that year, month by month, told by the people doing the work. In the 7th month the shrike cries. In the 8th month they spin. In the 9th month they prepare the winter clothes. In the 10th month the cricket comes under the bed. They plug the windows, they smoke out the rats, they seal the doors with mud, and they say to their wives and children, "The days are cold now. Come in and dwell in this house." Come in and dwell in this house. It is the oldest surviving sentence in that literature about going indoors for the winter, and it has been read aloud for 3,000 years, and it still does exactly what it was built to do. There was one problem they could not solve by leaving it alone, and it was riding towards them out of the grass. On the grasslands north of the frontier walls, at almost exactly the moment the empire was being unified, the scattered mounted peoples had been unified too. That is not a coincidence. A large settled empire on the border is an enormous, reliable source of things worth taking, and organizing to take them pays. The two systems created each other, and for the 2 millennia that followed. The relationship between the farmed South and the grazed North was the single most persistent fact in that part of the world. Their confederation was formidable. Every adult male was a mounted archer who had ridden since infancy. There was no distinction between the population and the army. They could move 100 miles in a day, strike a district, and be gone before a message reached the capital. They could not take walled cities easily, and they did not need to. The founding Han emperor tried to settle the matter directly, marched north with a large army in winter, outran his own supply column, and was surrounded on a mountain with the advance guard for 7 days in freezing weather. He got out, by most accounts, because his advisor sent a discreet and very large present to the wife of the northern ruler, along with a suggestion that conquering farmland would do her husband's people no good at all and would only trap him in a country he could not use. The encirclement opened at one corner, and the emperor rode out through it in fog with his men walking with arrows on the string. He never tried again. Instead, the Han adopted a policy of peace through kinship. An imperial princess sent north as a bride each generation, along with annual shipments of silk, grain, wine, and gold, and a formerly equal relationship between the two courts. It was tribute wearing polite clothes, and everybody knew it, and it went on for 60 years while the granaries filled. Then, in the 2nd century before the Common Era, a 16-year-old came to the throne and reigned for 54 years, and he was not a man for polite clothes. He is usually called the martial emperor. And under him, the empire doubled in size and nearly bankrupted itself doing it. He went on the offensive in the north, sending cavalry armies deep into the grasslands, thousands of miles, for years, under 2 brilliant young generals, one of them his wife's nephew, and the other a boy who commanded a strike force at 18 and was dead at 23. The Confederation was broken, split, and driven west, and the corridor running northwest between the mountains and the desert was seized and fortified and settled with garrison colonies. That corridor is the important part, because it is the road. Before the campaigns, he had sent an envoy west with 100 men to find a people who had been driven out of that region and who might, he hoped, be persuaded to attack the Confederation from the far side. The envoy was captured almost immediately and held for 10 years. He married there and had a son. He kept the staff of office that identified him as an imperial envoy for the entire decade. Then he escaped, and instead of going home, went on west, because he had not completed his mission. He crossed the mountains. He found the people he was looking for in a rich valley far to the west, and they told him politely that they were comfortable where they were and had no interest in a war of revenge. So he turned around, was captured again on the return, escaped again during a succession dispute, and arrived home 13 years after he had left, with one companion and his wife. His mission had failed completely, and the report he made to the emperor opened a door that stayed open for 1,500 years. Because he had seen things, he described kingdoms and cities and irrigated fields far to the west. He described a state with walled towns and markets where people sold goods and made wine from grapes. He described the horses of a certain western valley, taller and faster than anything in the east, which the local people said sweated blood. And he reported that in the markets of one of those distant places he had seen bamboo canes and cloth that he recognized, because they were made in the southwest of his own country, and when he asked, the merchants said they had bought them from traders coming from a country to the southeast of them, which meant there was already a route running through the mountains and jungles south of the empire that nobody in the imperial court had known existed. The world, in other words, was much larger than the court had assumed. It was full of states that could be dealt with, and some of them already had a taste for what the empire made. Everything followed from that report. The garrison colonies pushed the frontier out along the corridor. Embassies went west by the dozen, and caravans followed the embassies. The horses were obtained eventually after 2 military expeditions that were mounted essentially to acquire them, which is an unusual reason for a war and tells you what cavalry had become. And silk went west, not in one journey. Almost nobody ever traveled the whole distance. Goods moved in relays hand to hand through the oasis towns of the desert rim, over the mountains, across the plateaus, into the caravan cities of the west, and onto the ports of the inland sea. By the time a bolt of it reached the far side, its price had multiplied many times over, and its origin had become a rumor. The people at the western end knew only that it came from a country somewhere beyond the sunrise, and their name for that country was derived, most probably, from the name of the western state that had done the unifying. A serious man there complained in print that their women were dressing in a fabric that concealed nothing, and that the wealth of the empire was draining east to pay for it. Another wrote confidently that it grew on trees. Back the other way came the tall horses, and grapes and alfalfa and walnuts and pomegranates and cucumbers, and glass and gold and silver work, and in time, along that same road, in the caravans, folded up in the packs of merchants and monks, a religion from the subcontinent that would eventually give that country its greatest sculpture, its most beautiful architecture, and several centuries of intense argument. The road also carried in both directions diseases that neither end had any resistance to, which is the part that gets left out of the romantic accounts. The martial emperor did a great deal more than open the West. He established, at the recommendation of a scholar, a state academy to train officials in the classical texts, beginning with 50 students and growing over a century to tens of thousands. He set up a system of recommendation by which the commanderies were required to send up candidates of talent and filial conduct each year. That is not yet the great examination system, which took several more centuries to mature, but it is the beginning of the idea that the state should recruit by learning rather than by birth. And it made the books associated with that unemployed teacher the syllabus of power. He also, when the campaigns had emptied the treasury, took the salt and iron industries into state monopoly along with liquor, and set up state offices to buy commodities where they were cheap and sell them where they were dear. A generation later, the court held a formal debate about whether to keep the monopolies, and somebody wrote it down, and it survives. And it is about the best document of its kind anywhere. On one side, 60 scholars from the provinces argued that the state should withdraw from commerce, that the monopolies produced bad iron tools that peasants could not use, and expensive salt they could not afford, and that a government's business is moral instruction. On the other side, the minister who ran the system asked, with visible impatience, who was going to pay for the frontier defenses that kept the scholars' villages from being burned. That argument has never been settled anywhere, and reading 2,000 years of it in the original is oddly consoling. And in his reign, in the office of the court astronomer, a man was writing a book. His father had begun it and had made him promise to finish it. It was to be a complete history of everything from the mythical sages down to the present, and no one had ever attempted such a thing. Partway through, he made a mistake. A young general, hopelessly outnumbered, surrendered to the Northern Confederation after an 8-day fighting retreat during which his 5,000 infantry are said to have killed many times their own number. At court, everyone condemned him. The historian, asked his opinion, said that the man had fought extraordinarily well and that the surrender was probably a stratagem, and that in any case he had received no reinforcement. The emperor took this as an attack on the campaign's commander, who was his brother-in-law, and had the historian condemned. He was given the standard choice available to a man of his rank: pay an enormous fine, accept execution, or submit to castration. He had no money. Suicide would have been the honorable course, and everybody expected it. He chose the mutilation and lived, and said why in a letter to a friend that survives. He wrote that a man has only one death, and that it may be heavier than a mountain or lighter than a feather, depending on how he uses it. He listed the great men who had produced their finest work in disgrace and confinement. And he said that he had endured this because the book was not finished, and that if it were completed and hidden in a famous mountain and passed to someone who would transmit it, then he would have repaid the debt of his humiliation 10,000 times over, and no regret would remain. He finished it, 500,000 characters, 130 chapters, covering roughly 3,000 years. He organized it in a form that had never existed: annals of the rulers, chronological tables, treatises on subjects such as music and the calendar and rivers and canals and economics, hereditary houses of the great families, and then, at the end, 70 chapters of biographies, not only of ministers and generals, but of assassins, humorists, doctors, merchants, and men who were simply interesting. And he added to the close of many chapters a short signed comment in his own voice, saying what he personally thought and sometimes admitting that he did not know. That structure became the model for the official history of every dynasty in that country for the next 2,000 years, and it is because of him and because of the men who followed his pattern that we can talk about 4,000 years of that place at all. The trouble with a long, peaceful dynasty is land. In good times, a peasant family holds a few acres. Then there is one bad harvest, and they borrow. Then there is another, and they sell. The buyer is a great family with grain in store and cash to lend, and very often a relative in the local administration. The seller becomes a tenant on the ground he used to own, paying half his crop, and the great estate becomes large enough that its owner can arrange to be assessed lightly or not at all. So the taxable base shrinks while the untaxed estates swell, and the government, needing the same revenue from fewer registered farmers, raises the rate on exactly the people least able to pay it, which pushes more of them into selling. That cycle ran on that land for the following 2 millennia. Every dynasty began after a war that had killed enough people and destroyed enough records to make land available again. Every dynasty ended with the land concentrated, the treasury empty, the peasantry desperate, and the government unable to touch the families that had the money, because those families were the government. It is not the only reason dynasties fell, but it is under most of the others. By the last decades of the old era, the cycle had run its course. The imperial line had produced a run of short-lived and unimpressive emperors, and real power sat with the family of a dowager empress. The most capable member of that family was a nephew of hers, a scholarly, austere, immensely respectable man who lived simply, gave his salary away, and was regarded by the classicists of the academy as the finest gentleman of the age. He served as regent for an infant. Then he took the throne himself in the year 9 of our era, announcing a new dynasty and a return to the golden institutions of the deep past. His program was radical. He nationalized the land, declaring it all the property of the state, forbade its sale, and set a maximum holding for a family, with the surplus to be redistributed to the landless. He abolished the buying and selling of people. He restored state monopolies and a price-stabilizing system. He reformed the currency repeatedly and confusingly. He renamed almost everything, including offices, districts, and foreign rulers, on the grounds that the ancient names were more correct. Almost none of it worked. The land measures were unenforceable against precisely the families that had put him in power, and he repealed them within 3 years. The currency reforms wrecked confidence. The renaming insulted the Northern Confederation into war. And then the Yellow River, which had been silting up for a century while the maintenance budget went elsewhere, broke its banks catastrophically, swung its course to the other side of a peninsula, and drowned the most densely populated farmland in the empire. Millions were displaced. Famine followed, and then a rising of starving peasants who painted their eyebrows red so as to tell each other apart in a fight, and the great families raised their own forces. And within a few years, the capital was stormed and the reformer was killed in his palace tower. He is one of history's genuinely difficult cases. Later official historians who wrote for the restored dynasty painted him as a hypocrite and a usurper who had spent 30 years faking virtue. Modern readers sometimes swing too far the other way and call him a socialist born 2 millennia early. Probably he was a sincere antiquarian who believed the ancient books contained a workable blueprint, and who discovered that you cannot legislate an imagined past onto a real country, especially when the people you must dispossess are the ones holding your ladder. A member of the old imperial house won the wars that followed, moved the capital east to the city out on the plain, and restored the dynasty. The two halves are usually called the Western and the Eastern by the position of their capitals, and together they make up those 4 centuries. The second half was less expansive and in some ways more inventive. Somewhere around the year 105, a court official responsible for the imperial workshops presented the throne with a new writing material. People had written on bamboo strips, which are heavy. A serious memorandum could be a cartload, and there is a scholar of that period described as needing 5 carts of books to travel. They had written on silk, which is light and lovely and absurdly expensive. What the workshop official did was to take bark, hemp waste, old rags, and worn fishing nets, beat them to pulp in water. Lift the pulp on a screen, press it, and dry it. Paper, cheap, light, made from rubbish, and it took the brush beautifully. It spread through the empire within a century, and it did not reach the western end of the caravan roads for 600 years after that, and it did not reach Europe for 1,000. The gap is worth sitting with. For a very long stretch of world history, one civilization could afford to write things down casually and the others could not, and a great deal follows from that. The same century produced a court astronomer of extraordinary range, a poet, a painter, a mathematician who calculated the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter more accurately than anyone before him in that tradition, and the builder of a water-powered rotating celestial globe that turned in time with the sky. He also built an instrument for detecting earthquakes. The description says it was a bronze vessel the size of a wine jar, with 8 dragon heads spaced around the outside, each holding a bronze ball in its mouth, and 8 open-mouthed bronze toads sitting below. When the ground moved, somewhere a mechanism inside released one ball, which fell into the toad's mouth beneath with a loud clang. And the direction of the fallen ball indicated the direction of the shock. The court thought it was a toy until, one day, a ball dropped and nobody in the capital had felt anything at all, and a certain amount of quiet amusement followed at the inventor's expense. Several days later, a rider came in from a commandery some 400 miles to the northwest, reporting an earthquake on that day. Nobody laughed after that. The dynasty ran on for another century and then unwound in the usual way, with the addition of two particular poisons. The court was captured by a long war between the families of the empresses and the palace eunuchs, each faction slaughtering the other whenever it got the upper hand, with the scholar officials caught between and periodically purged in the hundreds. And out in the countryside, a religious movement founded on healing and confession and the promise of a coming age of great peace grew to hundreds of thousands of followers organized into districts and rose in rebellion wearing yellow headcloths. To crush it, the court gave the provincial governors permission to raise their own armies. They raised them, and they never gave them back. Within 20 years, the empire existed only on paper. The last emperor was a puppet passed between warlords, and the country broke into 3 kingdoms, whose wars became the most beloved historical novel in the language, which is a fate no one at the time would have found consoling. So let us come up out of it now, gently, and look at what 4,000 years actually left behind. It left a script that never broke. The characters cut into that turtle shell by the fire at the very beginning of tonight evolved into the seal script standardized by the first emperor's minister, and that into the clerical script written with a brush on the new paper, and that into the forms in use today. A modern reader can look at a bronze inscription from 3,000 years ago and, with training, read it. No other writing system on earth has that continuity. It left the idea that a right to govern is conditional, granted by heaven on account of good government, and forfeitable. It has been used to justify obedience, and it has been used to justify overthrow, and it is still, in altered clothing, part of how legitimacy is discussed in that country. It left a bureaucracy staffed by examination rather than birth, an idea so unusual that when Europeans encountered it in the 18th century, they found it startling and eventually copied it, which is why civil services elsewhere still hold entrance examinations. It left the ceremonies and the family ethics of a teacher who could not find employment, and the quiet countercurrent of the book about water and empty spaces, and the two of them have run side by side ever since, the public and the private, the ledger and the fishing rod. It left silk, paper, cast iron, the crossbow, the seismoscope, the compass, and a river taming system in a southwestern basin that has been working continuously since before the first emperor was born and watered somebody's rice this morning. And it left an army of clay standing in the dark under a field of persimmon trees, 7,000 men in 11 corridors, each face finished separately by hand, painted pink and purple and green, facing east towards kingdoms that no longer existed, waiting for an attack that was never going to come, on behalf of someone who had been dead for 2,200 years before 3 farmers looking for water in a dry spring put a spade through the roof of the world he built. They are still digging there. They will be digging there long after all of us have stopped. History does not disappear. It only settles layer on layer like the lowest coming down on that plain on the wind until it becomes the ground we are standing on. Are you still awake? If you are, there is another long, quiet history waiting for you on the screen, and it will start on its own, and you do not have to do anything at all. If this one helped, you might leave a like or subscribe. But only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And if you are still lying there with your eyes open, leave your location and your local time in the comments before you drift off. Somebody in another country, in another season, will read it in the middle of their own long night and feel a little less alone. Now let the pillow have the rest of the weight. Let your jaw come unclenched. Let the last of the day go, all of it, the whole of it, very slowly, very slowly, very slowly. Close your eyes. Good night and sweet dreams.